I was watching the final minutes of a tied Sunday football game when my daughter-in-law snatched the remote directly from my hand. She pointed a manicured finger toward the dark hallway. "Go back to your room, old man," she told me with a chilling smirk. "My friends are coming over, and this is our living room now." The funny thing was that she forgot one crucial detail. I paid for every single brick of that house. I did not argue with her. I simply stood up and made a phone call that would change her reality forever. My name is Jermaine. I am 68 years old. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant guest exactly who built the roof over their head. The television screen went black right before the game-winning touchdown. I looked up from my custom leather recliner. Haley stood there with her hands on her hips, her blonde hair perfectly styled for the guests she had invited into my home. She did not ask me to leave the room. She issued a direct order in a tone reserved for an unruly child. I shifted my gaze to the adjacent armchair. My son Cameron sat there with a glass of water in his hand. He did not look at me. He stared intently at the hardwood floor as if he found the grain pattern utterly fascinating. He let his wife evict his father from a room I had built from the ground up. Cameron's cowardly silence struck a deep, agonizing chord in my chest. I had seen that exact same posture before. It was the identical hollow stare he held the day my wife Brenda passed away. On that terrible afternoon in the hospital room while I held Brenda's lifeless hand and my world shattered, Cameron just stared at the linoleum tiles. He offered no comfort then, and he offered no defense now. That silence confirmed everything I needed to know. He was not a helpless victim of a domineering wife. He was entirely complicit in my humiliation. For 3 years, I had allowed them to live in my house rent-free after Cameron lost his corporate job. I had retreated to the guest bedroom to give them space. I had stayed out of their way. I had paid the utility bills, covered the property taxes, and kept the refrigerator fully stocked. But tonight, Haley had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had claimed ownership of my sanctuary. She had looked a retired structural engineer in the eye and claimed dominion over the very structure he had purchased with his own sweat. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand respect. Respect is not something you beg for from ungrateful people. It is something you enforce through absolute action. I looked at Haley's triumphant face and then at Cameron's bowed head. I stood up slowly from my leather recliner. I gave Haley a single calm nod. I walked down the hallway, stepped into my bedroom, and locked the door behind me. I heard Haley laugh in the living room, a sharp, victorious sound. She thought she had won. She thought I was just a defeated old man retreating to his cave. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. The cool blue light illuminated the blueprints and structural schematics pinned to my bulletin board. I had spent 40 years wearing heavy steel-toe boots, climbing scaffolding, and working double shifts on construction sites across the city. My back ached on rainy days because I had literally traded my physical health for financial security. I had purchased this massive 4-bedroom house with cold, hard cash earned through decades of relentless labor. Every piece of furniture, every Persian rug, every imported painting in that living room belonged to me. Haley wanted her living room. I decided to give her exactly what she asked for. A living room that belonged solely to her. I opened a search browser. I did not look for a lawyer or a mediator. I looked for a heavy-duty commercial moving company. I needed a crew that possessed the equipment and the manpower to clear out an entire floor in a matter of hours. I found a specialized logistics firm that offered discreet early morning services for corporate evictions. I dialed their emergency after-hours number. A dispatcher answered on the second ring. I gave him my exact address and a precise list of items. I told him I needed 5 of his strongest men at my front door before the sun came up. The dispatcher hesitated, stating that early morning residential jobs required a massive premium fee. I asked him for the total. He named a price that would have made most people hang up the phone immediately. I pulled out my credit card and paid double the requested amount without a second thought. I attached one strict condition to the exorbitant payment. The crew had to operate in absolute total silence. I closed my laptop and packed a small overnight bag. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of Haley's friends arriving. I heard their loud music, their clinking wine glasses, and their arrogant laughter echoing through my house. They were celebrating in a kingdom that was about to vanish completely. Every burst of laughter from the living room only hardened my resolve. They viewed me as an obsolete relic, a ghost haunting my own property. They had vastly underestimated the tactical precision of a man who spent his entire life calculating load-bearing walls and controlled demolitions. At exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, a massive diesel engine rumbled softly at the end of my driveway. The autumn air was biting and cold. I looked out the window. A heavy-duty, unmarked moving truck idled on the street, its headlights piercing the morning mist. I unlocked my bedroom door and walked quietly down the hallway. The house was dead silent. Cameron and Haley were deeply asleep upstairs, recovering from their late-night party. The remnants of their arrogant celebration littered the coffee table. Empty bottles and stained napkins sat disrespectfully on my expensive furniture. I reached the front door and pulled it open. 5 burly men dressed in dark gray uniforms stood on my porch. The crew foreman stepped forward holding a digital tablet. He looked at me with professional efficiency, waiting for his instructions. I pulled a folded clipboard from my coat pocket and handed it directly to him. The paper contained a meticulous inventory of every single item in the living room. The leather recliner, the massive entertainment center, the antique lamps, the woven carpets. Everything had to go. I pointed toward the living room and gave the foreman a sharp nod. The purge was about to begin. The sound of heavy work boots marching across the hardwood floor echoed through the house. The crew moved with the mechanical precision I had paid for. They unbolted the custom mahogany television stand from the wall anchors. They hoisted the oversized leather recliner. They rolled up the hand-woven Persian rug that Brenda had spent weeks selecting for our anniversary. Stripped of its furnishings, the living room transformed into a cavernous, echoing void. The pale, rectangular outlines on the painted walls were the only remaining evidence that a home had ever existed here. Footsteps slapped frantically against the wooden staircase. Haley descended the steps 2 at a time, clutching her silk robe tightly around her waist. She skidded to a halt at the bottom landing. Her eyes darted across the barren room. The acoustics of the space had completely changed, amplifying her sharp intake of breath. She stared at the moving crew as they carried the final glass coffee table out the front door. Panic quickly contorted her features into absolute outrage. She pointed a trembling finger at the foreman, demanding that he drop the furniture immediately. She shrieked that she was calling the police to report a home invasion. I stepped directly into her line of sight, blocking her view of the workers. I did not raise my voice. I reached inside the breast pocket of my coat and retrieved a thick, neatly folded stack of papers. I unrolled the documents and held them out. These were original purchase invoices, delivery receipts, and credit card statements. Every single piece of paper bore my name and my signature. I informed her coldly that the police would find a man relocating his own legally purchased property. I reminded her of her explicit command from the previous night. She had claimed this space as her living room. I simply removed my personal belongings so she could enjoy the sheer emptiness of her new territory. Cameron stumbled down the stairs moments later. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wide with sleep and sudden shock. He gripped the banister, surveying the naked floorboards and the bare walls. He looked from the empty room to his wife, and finally to me. The silent, cowardly son from last night vanished, replaced by an aggressive, desperate man. He marched across the room and thrust his finger inches from my face. He accused me of losing my mind. He yelled that this was a psychotic episode, a complete mental breakdown caused by age and grief. He demanded that I order the men to bring every item back inside immediately. I looked at the young man standing before me. I searched his face for the boy who used to hand me wrenches in the garage, the son I had worked overtime to put through college. I found nothing but an entitled stranger fiercely defending a stolen throne. I did not argue. I did not attempt to justify my actions or match his frantic volume. A man who owns the ground beneath his feet does not need to shout. I slowly folded the receipts and slid them back into my pocket. I adjusted the collar of my wool coat and secured the final button. Without a single word, I turned my back on both of them. I walked through the open front doorway and stepped onto the porch. The crisp morning air hit my face sharp and clearing. The moving truck's massive diesel engine revved loudly. The foreman gave me a brief salute from the cab before releasing the air brakes. The heavy vehicle rolled away down the quiet suburban street, carrying the heavy remnants of my past. I walked down the driveway toward my parked sedan. Cameron ran out onto the porch, his voice cracking as he hurled threats into the cold air. Haley stood behind him, clutching his arm, her previous arrogance completely shattered by the sheer reality of the empty house. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and shut the door firmly. The heavy glass and steel immediately silenced their frantic yelling. I inserted the key into the ignition and started the engine. Before shifting into gear, I glanced up at the rearview mirror. Cameron had stopped shouting. He was standing near the edge of the porch, clutching his smartphone to his ear. His free hand was pacing through his hair in a gesture of pure panic. I watched his face carefully. 40 years of reading lips on deafening construction sites had honed my ability to understand silent conversations. I watched his mouth form the words bank manager and dementia. I read the frantic movement of his lips as he demanded the immediate freezing of all retirement accounts belonging to his father. He was trying to cut off my financial air supply. He was attempting to weaponize my age against me to lock me out of the very wealth I had spent a lifetime building. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. This was no longer just a dispute over a living room or a television remote. This was a calculated strike against my survival. They intended to label me incompetent and strip me of my resources. I gripped the leather steering wheel, shifted the transmission into drive, and pressed my foot hard against the accelerator. I had to reach the bank before he did. I drove straight to the downtown branch of my bank. My tires gripped the asphalt as I navigated the morning traffic with cold precision. I did not bother waiting in the velvet-roped line for a teller. I walked directly into the glass-walled office of the branch manager. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from his desk and placed my state identification on the polished wood. I issued a direct, uncompromising command. I required a complete physical printout of every transaction from my primary savings account for the last 90 days. I then instructed him to immediately freeze all secondary access and revoke any authorized user privileges attached to my accounts. The manager blinked in shock, but my tone left absolutely no room for negotiation. He typed rapidly on his keyboard. A second later, his desk phone began to ring incessantly. The caller identification flashed on his digital display. It was Cameron. My cowardly son was desperately trying to lock me out of my own life. I instructed the manager to ignore the call and proceed with the printout. I watched the flashing red light on the phone with absolute detachment. Cameron was exactly 10 minutes too late. The heavy-duty printer hummed to life, spitting out pages of financial history. I took the warm sheets of paper and began to scan the columns. Decades of calculating stress loads and structural material costs had trained my eyes to catch numerical anomalies instantly. The numbers on the page formed a damning structural failure. A massive financial sinkhole existed in my retirement savings. Over $20,000 had been systematically drained over the past 3 months alone. The withdrawals were not simple electronic transfers. They were processed as physical paper checks. I pushed the papers back across the desk and demanded to see the digital scans of the cleared documents. The manager clicked his mouse and turned his large monitor toward me. The screen displayed a series of checks written out for exorbitant amounts. I stared at the signature line on the bottom right corner of each slip. The blue ink formed my name, but the handwriting was an absolute insult to my intelligence. The loops were jagged and rushed. The slant of the letters leaned heavily to the left. I had spent 40 years drafting architectural plans and engineering schematics with exact mechanical precision. My authentic signature was a rigid block of structured, unmistakable lines. This forgery was a clumsy, desperate imitation. I recognized the cursive style immediately. I had seen it on countless birthday cards and grocery lists left on my kitchen counter. It was Haley's handwriting. She had dug through my private desk drawer, stolen a book of emergency checks, and forged my name with breathtaking arrogance. My hands ached daily from decades of hauling rebar and pouring concrete. Her soft, manicured hands had effortlessly stolen the reward of that grueling labor with a stolen pen. Cameron knew about this theft. His frantic phone call to the bank was not an attempt to protect the funds from an insane old man. He was trying to cover up a blatant felony. They realized the moving company stunt meant I was no longer a passive, silent roommate. I was an active threat to their criminal enterprise. They needed to freeze the account before I noticed the missing $20,000. I instructed the manager to trace the routing numbers on the deposited checks. I needed to know exactly where my 40 years of grueling overtime pay had vanished. The manager pulled up the transaction history and read the destination accounts aloud. The revelations were sickening. $5,000 had been wired directly to an exclusive fashion boutique in the city center. Another $15,000 served as a massive down payment at a luxury European car dealership. The lease agreement was registered entirely under Haley's name. My son and his wife were completely broke. Cameron had lost his corporate salary, yet Haley absolutely refused to surrender her opulent lifestyle. Instead of adjusting their spending and living within their means, she decided to cannibalize my retirement fund. She was siphoning the lifeblood of a retired African-American engineer to maintain her illusion of wealth among her elite snobbish friends. She paraded around town in designer clothes and a luxury vehicle purchased with the pain in my joints and the sweat of my brow. I felt a cold, calculated fury solidify in my chest. I asked the manager to print the check scans and the routing details. I folded the damning evidence carefully and placed it into my inner coat pocket. I thanked the man for his time and walked out of the bank with lethal clarity. I drove back to my house with the physical proof of their federal wire fraud burning a hole in my pocket. I turned onto my quiet street and slowed my vehicle. A sleek silver sedan was parked brazenly in my driveway. I pulled up to the curb and stepped out of my car. I walked toward the side gate of my property. A middle-aged white man wearing a tailored gray suit and polished dress shoes was standing right in the middle of my lawn. He held a digital measuring wheel and was calculating the square footage of my backyard patio. I walked up behind him and cleared my throat loudly. The man turned around and offered a practiced professional smile. He assumed I was a landscaper or a neighbor. He reached into his jacket and handed me a glossy business card. He introduced himself as a certified real estate appraiser. He casually explained that Cameron had hired him to conduct a rush valuation of the property because the owner of the house was permanently relocating to an assisted living facility. I stepped directly into the path of the appraiser. The man wore a tailored gray suit that had never seen a day of hard labor. He held a digital measuring wheel in one hand and a thick clipboard in the other. He offered me a practiced artificial smile, assuming I was the neighborhood landscaper or perhaps a confused neighbor. I did not return the smile. I reached out and snatched the clipboard right out of his manicured hands. The sudden aggression broke his professional facade instantly. He took a nervous step backward. I scanned the top sheet of paper. The document listed my property address, the estimated square footage, and a requested rush valuation. The client authorizing the appraisal was listed clearly as Cameron. I looked the man dead in the eye and demanded to know why a stranger was sizing up my backyard. The appraiser stammered, his voice losing all its corporate confidence. He explained that he was hired by my son to evaluate the market value of the estate. He quickly added that Cameron had assured the firm the current owner was permanently relocating to an assisted living facility by the end of the month. The sheer audacity of the lie chilled the air around us. I handed the clipboard back to the terrified man. I instructed him to pack his measuring tools and leave my property immediately, warning him that the police would be called for trespassing if he lingered another 60 seconds. He practically sprinted toward his vehicle. I turned my back on the retreating car and marched toward the back door of my house. The time for silent observation was over. I pushed through the patio doors and walked directly into the kitchen. Cameron and Haley were standing by the marble island. Haley was casually sipping sparkling water from a tall glass. Cameron was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. They both froze when I entered the room. The air in the kitchen grew dense and suffocating. I did not shout. I walked right up to the edge of the island and informed them that I had just chased their hired appraiser off my lawn. I demanded an explanation for the nursing home lie. Cameron's eyes darted toward the floor, reverting instantly to his cowardly habit of avoiding conflict. He opened his mouth to formulate a pathetic excuse, but Haley slammed her glass down on the granite countertop. She stepped in front of her husband, shielding his weakness with her unbridled arrogance. She did not bother to deny the scheme. She looked at me with absolute disdain and delivered a monologue of pure, unfiltered greed. She stated that the entire neighborhood was gentrifying rapidly. Property values had tripled over the last 5 years. She coldly pointed out that Cameron was the sole heir listed in my will anyway. In her twisted logic, they were simply expediting a financial transition that was bound to happen eventually. She spoke to me not as a father-in-law, and certainly not as the man who owned the very floor she stood on. She spoke to me as an expired asset, a stubborn obstacle standing between her and a massive influx of generational wealth. She demanded that I accept reality. She insisted I was getting too old to manage such a large estate and that a care facility was the most practical destination for my remaining years. The sheer cruelty of her justification hung in the air. She was casually arranging my institutionalization to fund her luxury car leases and designer shopping sprees. The bank documents detailing her $20,000 theft were burning a hole in my inner coat pocket. I could have pulled them out right then. I could have thrown the forged checks in their faces and destroyed their arrogant illusion instantly. But decades of constructing high-rise buildings had taught me a fundamental lesson about demolition. You never detonate the explosives while you are still standing inside the structure. You plant the charges deep within the foundation. You step back to a safe distance, and you watch the collapse from the outside. I needed them to feel secure. I needed them to believe their malicious campaign was succeeding flawlessly. I performed a highly calculated tactical retreat. I released a long, shaky breath and allowed my shoulders to slump forward. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, pretending to steady my trembling hands. I lowered my head, staring at the floorboards, perfectly mimicking the defeated posture of a broken, exhausted old man who had finally realized he was entirely powerless. I did not utter a single word in my defense. I turned around slowly, dragging my feet slightly across the hardwood floor, and shuffled down the hallway toward my bedroom. Before my door clicked shut, I heard Haley release a sharp, victorious sigh. She whispered to Cameron that the hardest part was over and that the old man had finally surrendered to the inevitable. They believed they had broken my spirit. They believed the house was theirs. That night, the house was submerged in darkness. Cameron and Haley were fast asleep upstairs, completely oblivious to the storm gathering beneath them. I slipped out the back door into the biting autumn air. I walked quietly over to the large blue recycling bin positioned beside the garage. Criminals always grow sloppy when they believe no one is watching. They discard their secrets with arrogant carelessness. I lifted the heavy plastic lid and began to dig through the refuse. I pushed past empty wine bottles, discarded fashion catalogs, and greasy pizza boxes from their dinner. At the very bottom of the bin, wedged beneath a pile of junk mail, I found a crumpled sheaf of heavy stock paper. I pulled it out and smoothed the wrinkled pages under the pale, flickering glow of the back porch light. The header on the document belonged to a private psychiatric clinic located in the city center. I read the text with a mounting sense of absolute horror. It was a formal medical evaluation. My full legal name was printed clearly at the top of the page. The paragraphs below detailed a fabricated history of severe cognitive decline, aggressive outbursts, and dangerous memory lapses. The final page contained a devastating clinical diagnosis of severe rapid-onset dementia, declaring me entirely unfit to manage my own financial or personal affairs. The signature at the bottom of the evaluation was scrawled in bold blue ink belonging to a licensed physician. They were not just hoping to talk me into a nursing home. They were manufacturing the legal medical documentation required to strip away my human rights and lock me in an asylum against my will. I sat across from Attorney Gallagher early the next morning. The heavy leather chair creaked as I leaned forward and slid the crumpled, stained medical document across the polished mahogany desk. The faint smell of stale pizza grease still clung to the paper. Gallagher picked it up carefully by the edges. He adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the clinical diagnosis of severe, rapid-onset dementia bearing my name. He did not express shock or offer me empty platitudes. 40 years of practicing family law in this city had stripped him of any illusions about human nature. He set the paper down flat on his desk and looked me directly in the eye. He confirmed my worst fear with cold professional detachment. This fabricated evaluation was the mandatory first step in establishing legal guardianship. Cameron and Haley were meticulously building a fraudulent paper trail to present to a judge. Once a court declared me mentally incompetent, Cameron would automatically be granted absolute power of attorney over my life. He could legally authorize my forced removal to a locked psychiatric asylum. He could drain my bank account, sell the house I had built with my own hands, and erase my existence entirely. They were not just attempting to steal my money to fund their luxury car leases. They were executing a legally sanctioned kidnapping. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but I pushed the anger aside instantly. Emotion is a useless tool in a legal battle. I needed structural integrity. I looked at Gallagher and asked what our defensive countermeasure would be. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a gold pen against his legal pad. He stated that a simple defense was entirely insufficient against this level of malice. We needed to launch a preemptive strike that would permanently dismantle their entire financial incentive from the ground up. Gallagher turned to his computer and began drafting the architecture of my new financial fortress. He proposed the immediate creation of an irrevocable trust. Unlike a standard will, which Cameron could easily contest or override if he ever secured power of attorney, an irrevocable trust is a concrete vault. Once I transferred my assets into it, I legally ceased to be the direct owner. The trust itself would own the property, and a trust cannot be diagnosed with dementia or locked in a nursing home. I instructed Gallagher to proceed immediately without hesitation. I spent the next 2 hours sitting in that quiet office signing stacks of heavily vetted legal documents. My hand cramped, but I did not stop. I transferred the deed of the massive 4-bedroom house directly into the trust. I moved every single dollar from my savings, my retirement accounts, and my investment portfolios into the same protected entity. I officially appointed Gallagher as the primary trustee, stripping Cameron of any future legal standing or access. The process required multiple notarized signatures and a recorded video statement confirming my absolute mental clarity. A junior associate set up a camera on a tripod. I stared directly into the digital lens and stated my name, the current date, and my explicit, unwavering intention to disinherit my son. I articulated clearly that Cameron was to receive absolutely nothing from my estate upon my death. The paper trail we created was legally bulletproof, reinforced with ironclad clauses. Even if Cameron managed to find a corrupt judge to sign a guardianship order in the future, he would inherit custody of a man who owned absolutely zero assets. The house would be untouchable. The money would be invisible. He would be fighting a brutal war for a kingdom that no longer existed. Gallagher sealed the finalized documents in a heavy manila envelope and locked them inside his fireproof safe. The tactical shift was complete. My wealth was completely insulated from their greedy hands. However, defending my assets was only half of the equation. I needed to destroy the fraudulent medical foundation they were trying to build. I needed to find out exactly who was willing to sign a fake dementia diagnosis without ever examining the patient. I left the law firm and drove straight to a nondescript brutalist office building on the industrial side of town. I walked up a flight of concrete stairs and entered the dim workspace of private investigator Ramirez. Ramirez was a former fraud detective who operated strictly on results, not pleasantries. His desk was cluttered with surveillance photos and empty coffee cups. I sat down and placed a clean copy of the forged medical evaluation directly on his metal desk. I pointed a calloused finger at the signature of the licensed physician scrawled at the bottom of the page. I explained the situation briefly and precisely, outlining the home invasion, the stolen funds, and the nursing home plot. A doctor had diagnosed me with a severe degenerative brain disease without ever taking my blood pressure, asking me a single question, or conducting a basic cognitive test. Fabricating medical records to facilitate elder abuse and financial theft is a severe federal felony. I hired Ramirez on the spot to track this phantom physician down. I needed to know his financial status, his professional history, his exact location, and exactly how he was connected to Cameron and Haley. Ramirez did not blink. He accepted my retainer in cash and slid the medical evaluation into a clear plastic folder. He promised a preliminary report within 48 hours. I returned to my house, parked my car in the driveway, and walked through the front door. The house was quiet. Cameron and Haley were in the kitchen, casually eating a gourmet lunch as if they were not actively plotting my institutionalization. I walked past them without uttering a single word, maintaining my careful facade of an exhausted, deteriorating old man. Let them enjoy their stolen meals. The trap was already set and the timer was ticking. 2 days later, my phone vibrated intensely in my pocket while I was organizing my closet. It was a secure text message from Ramirez. I opened the notification and found a high-resolution photograph taken from a discreet, elevated distance. The image showed a bustling, upscale outdoor cafe. Haley was sitting at a small wrought iron table, laughing with her head thrown back and drinking a glass of white wine. The man sitting across from her was wearing a pristine white medical coat over a tailored designer shirt. I zoomed in on the image. His name badge perfectly matched the exact signature on my fabricated dementia evaluation. The text message below the photograph delivered the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Ramirez had successfully uncovered the corrupt doctor's identity. The physician was not a random professional bribed by Cameron on the dark web. He was Haley's older cousin. The conspiracy to lock me in an asylum and steal my life savings was not just a desperate act of greed orchestrated by my son. It was a highly coordinated, cold-blooded family affair designed to feed her bloodline at the total expense of mine. A sleek black town car pulled into my driveway late Friday afternoon. I watched from the kitchen window as the driver unloaded a matching set of designer leather luggage. Haley's parents, the Harpers, had arrived from the East Coast. They stepped out of the vehicle with the exaggerated caution of wealthy socialites stepping onto contaminated soil. Mr. Harper wore a tailored navy blazer and surveyed my neighborhood with a visible sneer. Mrs. Harper adjusted her silk scarf and complained loudly about the humidity. Haley rushed out the front door to greet them. Her voice pitched an octave higher than usual, dripping with desperate sycophancy. She ushered them inside, frantic to present the illusion of a perfect upscale life. 10 minutes later, she found me in the kitchen wiping down the granite countertops. She crossed her arms and glared at me. She did not ask for a favor. She issued a mandate. She told me her parents were accustomed to a certain standard of living and that my presence would only confuse and embarrass them. She ordered me to take my dinner in the basement or remain locked in my bedroom for the entire weekend. She explicitly stated that my working-class demeanor did not fit the aesthetic of the evening. I looked at her flushed face, noting the absolute panic behind her arrogant demands. She was terrified that the man whose retirement fund she was actively draining might ruin her high society masquerade. I gave her a single dismissive nod, dried my hands on a towel, and walked down the hallway. I let her believe she had successfully banished me to the shadows of my own home. I did not go to the basement. I did not retreat to my bedroom. I stood perfectly still in the dark corridor connecting the kitchen to the formal dining room. The shadows concealed my presence entirely. I leaned against the heavy oak doorframe, a load-bearing pillar I had installed myself 30 years ago. The acoustics of the house carried every spoken syllable directly to my ears. I listened to the clinking of my crystal wine glasses and the scraping of expensive silver cutlery against porcelain plates. Haley had ordered catering from a high-end French restaurant, paying for the extravagant meal with the money she had stolen from my bank account. Mr. Harper dominated the conversation. His voice boomed through the dining room, thick with unearned authority and aged bourbon. He began to discuss the neighborhood. He called it a transition zone, a place that still smelled of cheap labor and broken communities. He casually dismissed the people who lived here as uneducated blue-collar relics who worked with their hands because they lacked the intellect to work with their minds. The racism in his tone was not subtle. It was woven into every condescending syllable, masking a deep contempt for anyone who had to sweat for a paycheck. He stated that it was a tragedy decent folks had to share a zip code with people who brought down the property value simply by existing. I waited for my son to speak. I waited for Cameron to defend the neighborhood he grew up in. I waited for him to defend the father who had sacrificed his joints and his youth to put a roof over his head. Instead, a sickening sound echoed through the hallway. Cameron laughed. He chuckled eagerly, a cowardly, sycophantic sound designed to appease his wealthy father-in-law. Cameron raised his glass and wholeheartedly agreed with the insult directed at his own father. The betrayal was absolute. It severed the final, fraying thread of paternal obligation I held for the boy I had raised. I stepped into the kitchen and picked up a heavy silver serving tray. I placed a crystal pitcher of iced water and 4 clean glasses onto the polished metal surface. I adjusted my posture, ensuring my spine was perfectly straight, and walked out of the shadows directly into the brightly lit dining room. The conversation died instantly. The Harpers froze, staring at me as if an apparition had just breached their exclusive sanctuary. Haley's face drained of all color, her jaw dropping in sheer panic. Cameron swallowed hard, his sycophantic smile vanishing into a grimace of pure terror. I ignored my son and his wife entirely. I walked smoothly to the head of the table and stood directly beside Mr. Harper. I poured a glass of iced water and placed it precisely next to his dinner plate. I looked down at his wrist and calmly complimented his gold Patek Philippe watch. I noted that it was a beautiful timepiece, the kind of luxury accessory only a man of true influence could afford. Mr. Harper puffed out his chest, completely misreading the situation, and offered a smug, patronizing thank you. I held his gaze and casually shifted the topic. I asked him if his vast experience in high society investments had ever brought him into contact with Dr. Arthur Vance. I watched the confusion wash over his face. I continued in a polite conversational tone. I asked Mr. Harper if he was familiar with the federal penalties regarding licensed physicians who forge psychiatric evaluations for their relatives to facilitate elder abuse and massive financial fraud. I casually noted that federal prosecutors tend to confiscate luxury watches and freeze offshore accounts when they dismantle medical conspiracies. The dining room fell completely suffocatingly silent. The only sound was the hum of the central air conditioning. Mr. Harper's smug expression melted into bewildered horror. He looked from me to his daughter, demanding an explanation. Haley's hands began to shake violently. Her silver dinner fork slipped from her trembling fingers and crashed loudly against her porcelain plate. She could not breathe. She knew exactly what name I had just dropped into the center of her perfect dinner party. Cameron sat paralyzed, staring at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a trapped animal. I did not raise my voice. I did not wait for an answer. I simply picked up the silver tray, bowed my head in a mock gesture of subservience, and walked back into the dark hallway. I left them to choke on their secrets. I returned to my bedroom and slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke up with absolute clarity. The final phase of my demolition required securing my most valuable physical assets before the police arrived to sweep the property. I walked over to the portrait of Brenda hanging on my wall and swung the frame aside to reveal my hidden wall safe. I punched in the numerical code and pulled the heavy steel door open. My heart stopped. The interior shelves were completely bare. The velvet box holding Brenda's diamond necklace was gone. I stood before the open steel safe in my bedroom, the cold reality of the missing velvet box locking my jaw tight. I did not waste precious time searching the house or interrogating the thieves upstairs. Interrogation only gives the guilty a chance to fabricate better lies. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Private Investigator Ramirez. I gave him the exact description of Brenda's custom diamond necklace, emphasizing the unique serial number engraved on the hidden platinum clasp. Ramirez understood the absolute urgency of the situation immediately. High-end jewelry stolen by desperate amateurs rarely leaves the city limits. They trade it for fast, untraceable cash at the nearest available counter. Less than 4 hours later, Ramirez sent me an encrypted text message containing an address. I drove my heavy sedan away from my manicured suburban neighborhood and crossed into the decaying industrial sector on the extreme south side of town. The visual contrast was physically jarring. Haley had spent the entire previous evening sipping imported French wine and discussing high society aesthetics with her snobbish parents. Now her unchecked greed had dragged my dead wife's memory into a neighborhood defined by rusted chain-link fences, shattered streetlights, and barred windows. I parked across the street from a dingy, heavily fortified pawn shop. The flickering red neon sign buzzed loudly against the cracked gray concrete facade. Debris littered the ruined sidewalk. This was the absolute end of the line for stolen goods and shattered lives. Haley and Cameron projected an image of absolute aristocratic wealth to the world, yet they were doing desperate business in the darkest gutters of the city. I locked my car and approached the reinforced steel door. I pressed the buzzer, waiting for the heavy magnetic lock to disengage with a loud, hollow clank. The interior smelled of stale cigarette smoke, tarnished metal, and profound human failure. I walked up to the thick bulletproof glass counter that separated the customers from the inventory. A heavy-set man with tired, sunken eyes and a stained flannel shirt sat behind the partition examining a gold watch through a specialized jeweler's loupe. I slid a clear, high-resolution photograph of Brenda wearing the diamond necklace beneath the narrow metal transaction slot. I looked the man dead in the eye. I told him I knew the piece had been brought into his shop less than 48 hours ago. The pawnbroker looked at the photograph, then slowly raised his gaze to meet my unblinking expression. He did not ask any defensive questions. He understood the unspoken heavy threat of police involvement and the subsequent confiscation of his inventory. He turned around without a single word, unlocked a secure drop box mounted directly to the interior brick wall, and retrieved the familiar black velvet case. He slid it back through the metal slot. I flipped the lid open. The brilliant cut diamonds caught the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the shop. I ran my calloused thumb over the delicate platinum clasp, feeling the familiar tiny engraving. It was Brenda's necklace. The pawnbroker cleared his throat and stated the retrieval price was exactly $4,000. The piece was officially insured for over $30,000. The thief had traded a priceless family heirloom for absolute pennies on the dollar. I did not bother to haggle. I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from my coat pocket, counted out the exact requested amount, and pushed the cash through the slot. I reclaimed my wife's memory from the filth. As the pawnbroker reached eagerly for the money, I placed my heavy hand firmly over the cash. I demanded to see the original pawn slip. He hesitated, citing strict store policy and customer confidentiality. I added 2 extra $100 bills to the top of the stack. Morality in this neighborhood was entirely transactional. The pawnbroker snatched the money and slid a yellow carbon copy across the counter. I stared intensely at the ink. The name printed on the seller line was a fabricated alias, but the signature at the bottom was entirely unmistakable. It was the exact same jagged, rushed, sloppy cursive I had analyzed on the forged bank checks. Haley had walked into this filthy shop, presented a fake identification card, and sold my dead wife's jewelry for a stack of dirty, untraceable bills. I stepped out of the pawn shop and walked aggressively back to my car, gripping the velvet box tightly in my fist. The biting autumn wind whipped across the empty street, but my mind was operating with crystalline mechanical precision. The disparate pieces of their criminal puzzle were finally snapping together to form a much larger, highly unstable structural foundation. Haley and Cameron were not simply greedy. Greed is a remarkably slow, methodical, and patient vice. Greed takes its time to maximize profit and minimize risk. Pawning a $30,000 custom diamond necklace for a mere $4,000 in fast cash is not an act of calculated greed. It is an act of pure, unadulterated panic. They had already siphoned $20,000 directly from my savings account. They had maxed out secret credit cards. Now they were ripping sacred jewelry out of a hidden wall safe to liquidate it for immediate street cash. The illusion of their wealthy, aristocratic lifestyle was a collapsing hollow shell. They were bleeding money at a catastrophic, unsustainable rate. You do not liquidate stolen diamonds for pennies unless a massive, terrifying pressure is crushing you from the outside. They were not hoarding wealth for a future real estate investment. They were desperately trying to survive the immediate present. Someone was aggressively squeezing my son. Cameron and Haley owed a massive, dangerous debt to an external entity, and that entity was clearly demanding immediate, unquestionable payment. I drove straight to Ramirez's office and dropped the yellow pawn slip directly onto his cluttered desk. I told him to completely halt tracking the forged medical documents and start tracing Cameron's hidden digital footprint. I needed to know exactly who owned my son. Ramirez bypassed standard legal channels and directly intercepted Cameron's encrypted cell phone records and offshore messaging applications. 30 minutes later, Ramirez spun his monitor around to face me. The screen displayed a series of brutal, terrifying text messages originating from untraceable burner phones. Cameron was not drowning in standard corporate credit card debt. He was a chronic, desperate gambling addict. He owed exactly $60,000 to an illegal violent sports betting syndicate operating out of the city's criminal underbelly. The text messages contained explicit, highly invasive photographs of Cameron's car and Haley's daily routine. The syndicate had grown entirely tired of partial payments funded by stolen jewelry. The final message on the screen delivered a non-negotiable, terrifying ultimatum. Cameron had to deliver the remaining $60,000 in cash by the final day of the month. If he missed the deadline, the bookies promised to shatter both of his legs with a steel pipe. The drive back from the private investigator's office felt like navigating a battlefield. The sky above the city broke open, unleashing a torrential downpour that pounded against the windshield of my heavy sedan. The rhythmic slapping of the wiper blades matched the cold mechanical processing of my thoughts. Cameron owed $60,000 to violent criminals. The deadline for his physical safety was the end of the month. The fake medical diagnosis, the stolen $20,000, the pawned diamond necklace, it was all part of a frantic, doomed scramble to pay off an illegal gambling syndicate. I turned onto my quiet suburban street, the tires hissing against the flooded asphalt. The massive oak trees lining the sidewalk swayed violently in the autumn storm. I pulled into my driveway, parked the car, and turned off the engine. The rain was an absolute deluge, blurring the outline of the 4-bedroom house I had built with 40 years of sweat and sacrifice. I zipped my heavy wool coat up to my chin, stepped out into the freezing downpour, and walked deliberately toward the front porch. The icy water soaked my shoulders instantly, but I did not rush. A man who owns his land does not run on it. I stepped under the slight overhang of the porch, retrieved my keychain from my pocket, and isolated the heavy brass key to the front door. I slid the metal shaft into the deadbolt. It stopped halfway. I pushed slightly harder, assuming the cold weather had caused the internal pins to stick. The key refused to turn. I withdrew the key and wiped the rainwater from my eyes to inspect the hardware. The metal collar surrounding the keyhole was gleaming scratch-free and entirely foreign. The brass was a completely different shade than the fixture I had installed a decade ago. The locks were brand new. I took a slow step back from the heavy oak door. The freezing rain continued to whip across the porch, soaking the fabric of my coat, but I stood perfectly still. I turned my head slightly toward the large bay window that looked into the front hallway. The interior lights were switched off, but the flashing glow of a television screen from the adjacent room provided enough illumination to cast a silhouette. Haley stood entirely still behind the sheer curtains. She was positioned at an angle, her body half hidden in the shadows, but her hands were raised. She was holding her smartphone directly up to the glass. She was recording me. The sheer malicious brilliance of her strategy crystallized in my mind instantly. This was not a simple lockout. This was a highly orchestrated theatrical trap. She was waiting for the exact reaction a confused, terrified old man would exhibit when suddenly locked out of his home in a freezing storm. She wanted me to panic. She wanted me to pound my heavy fists against the thick oak wood. She wanted me to scream my son's name, demand entry, and act like a delirious, aggressive dementia patient lost in his own neighborhood. She was currently on the line with Adult Protective Services painting a live audio picture of an unstable senior citizen having a violent psychiatric episode on her front porch. If I raised my voice, if I struck the door, if I showed even a fraction of the righteous anger burning inside my chest, I would give her the exact video evidence she needed to validate the forged medical documents. She would show the authorities the footage of a crazy old man attacking the house. The police would arrive, view the fake diagnosis, place me in a mandatory psychiatric hold, and hand the keys to my estate directly to Cameron. The trap was set perfectly. The jaws were open and waiting for me to step blindly inside. I looked directly at the dark silhouette behind the glass. I did not raise my hand. I did not touch the door again. I did not give her a single frame of usable footage. I simply turned my back on the house and walked calmly off the porch. I strolled back through the torrential rain with the measured, unhurried pace of a man walking through a pleasant spring park. I reached my sedan, opened the door, and slid back into the dry, heated comfort of the driver's seat. I started the engine and turned the heater up to its maximum setting. The warm air rushed over my soaked coat, driving the freezing chill from my bones. I pulled a microfiber cloth from the glove compartment and methodically dried the rainwater from my face and hands. I retrieved my cell phone from my pocket. I did not dial the emergency dispatch number. A chaotic emergency call can easily be misconstrued or intercepted by standard patrol officers lacking context. Instead, I dialed the direct desk number of the local police precinct, a number I knew by heart from my years of attending neighborhood council meetings. A seasoned desk sergeant answered the line. I identified myself, clearly stating my full legal name and my exact property address. I informed the sergeant that I was currently sitting in my driveway observing an active home invasion. I stated in a calm, highly professional tone that unauthorized individuals with confirmed ties to illegal gambling syndicates had unlawfully changed the locks on my residence and were currently occupying the premises. I mentioned that I possessed the original irrevocable trust documents proving my absolute ownership of the property and that the occupants were attempting a hostile, fraudulent takeover. The sergeant recognized the gravity of a situation involving organized crime links and property fraud. He told me to remain in my vehicle and lock the doors. I sat in the warm cabin of my car listening to the relentless drumming of the rain against the metal roof. Less than 5 minutes later, the dark street was illuminated by the violent strobing flash of red and blue emergency lights. 2 heavy police cruisers turned onto my block, their tires tearing through the deep puddles. They did not approach quietly. The wail of their sirens sliced through the noise of the storm, a deafening announcement of absolute authority. The cruisers angled sharply, blocking the bottom of my driveway and trapping any vehicle attempting to leave. 4 uniformed officers stepped out into the rain, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. I turned off my engine and stepped out of my car. The rain hit my face, but I did not flinch. I reached into my dry inner pocket and pulled out the thick, embossed legal folder provided by Attorney Gallagher. I walked steadily toward the lead officer holding the original, ironclad property deed out in front of me like a shield. The game of shadows was over. The physical dismantling of their world was about to take place in the blinding glare of the police lights. The blinding red and blue lights sliced through the torrential rain, painting the front of my house in frantic, flashing strokes. I stood silently on the soaked driveway alongside 4 heavily armed police officers. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered sergeant whose uniform was already darkened by the downpour, signaled his team to advance. We marched up the concrete walkway together. The officers did not gently ring the doorbell. The sergeant raised his heavy flashlight and struck the solid oak door 3 times with concussive, deafening force. The blows echoed loudly over the roaring storm. A minute passed. The sergeant hammered the door again, demanding immediate entry. The deadbolt finally clicked. The door swung open to reveal Cameron. He was wearing an expensive silk bathrobe, his hair deliberately tousled to suggest he had just been abruptly awakened from a deep sleep. His face instantly transformed into a mask of exaggerated, desperate relief. He let out a loud, theatrical sigh and placed his hand dramatically over his chest. He looked directly at the sergeant and thanked the officers profusely for finding me. Cameron spun a rapid rehearsed lie, his voice thick with fake concern. He claimed I was suffering from severe rapid onset Alzheimer's disease. He told the officers that my mental state had been deteriorating rapidly over the past few weeks, and that I had wandered out into the freezing storm during a severe delusional episode. He insisted they had been frantically searching the neighborhood for hours. He reached his hand out, attempting to gently grab my shoulder and pull me inside like a confused, helpless child. The audacity of his performance was entirely sickening. He was using the police as unwitting props in his scheme to institutionalize me. Before the sergeant could respond to Cameron's elaborate fabrication, Haley materialized in the foyer. She wore a pristine designer sleepwear set, clutching a cashmere shawl around her shoulders. She immediately burst into tears. It was a flawless, highly calculated display of emotional distress. She covered her mouth with her manicured hands and sobbed loudly, thanking the officers for bringing her poor, sick father-in-law home safe. She wailed that managing my aggressive dementia had become an impossible burden, and that they were in the tragic process of securing a specialized care facility for my own safety. The officers looked at her, then turned their gaze toward me, assessing the situation. They expected to see a shivering, disoriented old man. I did not shiver. I did not look confused. I stood perfectly straight, completely unfazed by the freezing rain beating against my heavy coat. I stepped past Cameron's outstretched hand and handed a thick, waterproof plastic sleeve directly to the sergeant. Inside the sleeve was the original notarized property deed held by my newly established irrevocable trust, clearly listing me as the sole beneficiary and primary resident. Behind the deed was an even more destructive document. It was a comprehensive certified mental health evaluation. I had spent 4 hours the previous afternoon undergoing an intense battery of cognitive and psychiatric testing. The document was officially signed and stamped by the chief of psychiatry at the city's leading research hospital. The date on the certification was yesterday. The evaluation explicitly declared that I was in absolute perfect possession of all my mental faculties, exhibiting zero signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or instability. The sergeant pulled his tactical flashlight from his belt and illuminated the documents. He read the official psychiatric certification carefully. He inspected the raised notary seal on the trust deed. He looked back up at Cameron and Haley. The sergeant's demeanor shifted instantly from protective concern to rigid, aggressive authority. He informed Cameron that the documents in his hand proved I was a legally competent adult and the absolute owner of the estate. He stated coldly that changing the locks on the legal property owner and attempting to deny them entry constituted an illegal eviction and severe domestic harassment. The sergeant placed his hand on his radio and ordered Cameron to surrender the new house keys immediately or face arrest for unlawful exclusion and filing a false police report. The heavy, suffocating weight of absolute failure crashed down on Cameron and Haley. The flashing police lights illuminated their utter panic. The commotion of the sirens and the loud, authoritative demands of the police officers had not gone unnoticed in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Porch lights flickered on up and down the street. Front doors creaked open. Neighbors stepped out onto their covered entryways, pulling their robes tight against the cold wind peering through the driving rain. Haley's carefully constructed high society masquerade shattered into a million irreparable pieces in front of her very eyes. The wealthy, refined image she relentlessly projected to the neighborhood was dead. Everyone on the block was currently watching her stand in her foyer, surrounded by armed police officers, being aggressively reprimanded for locking an elderly man out in a storm. The public humiliation was absolute and inescapable. Her face flushed violently red, and the fake tears dried up instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated mortification. She took a rapid step backward into the shadows of the hallway, desperately trying to hide from the piercing glare of the police cruisers and the prying eyes of the neighbors. Cameron was visibly trembling. His jaw worked silently, unable to formulate a single coherent excuse. The sergeant stepped closer, his physical presence dominating the doorway. He barked the order a second time, demanding the keys. Cameron's hands shook violently as he reached into his silk robe. He pulled out the heavy brass ring containing the newly cut keys. He did not hand them to the officer. He dropped them directly onto the wet concrete of the porch, his cowardly facade entirely broken by the sheer force of reality. I bent down, retrieved the keys from the freezing puddle, and wiped them dry on my coat. I looked at Cameron with absolute, chilling indifference. I walked past him, crossing the threshold of my own home, leaving him to endure the withering glare of the police officers alone. I shut the heavy oak door firmly behind me, locking it from the inside. The battle of the night was over, but the war was far from finished. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the neighborhood quiet and drenched. I walked out to the mailbox, my breath pluming in the crisp autumn air. I pulled out a stack of damp envelopes. Tucked between standard utility bills and junk mail was a thick formal letter from a secondary high-interest lending bank located 3 towns over. The envelope was addressed directly to me. I tore it open and scanned the first paragraph. My blood ran completely cold. The document was a formal notification of approval. Someone had used my forged signature and stolen personal identification to successfully take out a massive second mortgage against my house. The depth of Cameron's desperation was far worse than I had calculated. I drove the damp, wrinkled letter straight to Attorney Gallagher's office. The morning sun had barely crested the skyline, but Gallagher was already at his desk, drinking black coffee. I placed the notification of the second mortgage flat on his leather blotter. He read the document with the surgical precision of a seasoned prosecutor. The secondary bank had approved a loan for exactly $100,000 against the equity of my home. Gallagher logged into the county clerk's digital database to pull the original filing. The screen illuminated the depth of the criminal conspiracy. Cameron had not simply walked into a bank and asked for money, he had executed a highly coordinated fraud. The file contained a comprehensive power of attorney document granting my son absolute financial control over my assets. The signature at the bottom was a flawless replication of my own. Beside my forged name sat a bright crimson notary stamp, officially certifying the document as legally binding. Gallagher enlarged the notary seal. The registered name belonged to Marcus Harper, another of Haley's wealthy, well-connected cousins. They were utilizing their entire aristocratic family network to legitimize their theft. Cameron had secured the $100,000 to completely erase his $60,000 debt to the illegal sports betting syndicate, pocketing the remaining $40,000 to sustain Haley's luxurious masquerade. They had successfully weaponized the equity of my lifelong sanctuary to save Cameron's legs from a bookie's steel pipe. The sheer audacity of using my home to pay off underworld criminals showcased a level of depravity I had never anticipated from my own flesh and blood. Gallagher printed a high-resolution copy of the forged power of attorney and slid it across the desk. I stared at the signature. It was not a clumsy, desperate scribble. It was an absolute masterpiece of replication. The slant of the capital J, the heavy downward pressure on the M, the slight trailing fade at the end of my last name. It was perfect. A profound, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest as a specific memory surfaced from the depths of my mind. I was transported back 20 years, standing in the cramped kitchen of our old starter home. Cameron was 15 years old, clutching his very first summer paycheck from a local hardware store. He was nervous, unsure of how to navigate the adult world of banking. I had pulled out a chair, sat him down at the kitchen table, and placed my own checkbook in front of him. I spent 2 hours that evening teaching my son the mechanics of a proper signature. I taught him how to anchor his wrist, how to apply consistent pressure to the paper, and how to create a fluid, continuous motion that could never be easily duplicated. I told him a man's signature was his unbreakable bond, the ultimate proof of his honor in a world built on contracts. He had absorbed every single detail of that lesson with the keen attention of a devoted son. Now, 2 decades later, he had weaponized that exact fatherly instruction to orchestrate my financial execution. He used the muscle memory I had painstakingly instilled in him to forge my identity, steal the equity of the home I built, and fund his degenerate gambling addiction. The betrayal cut deeper than the theft of the money. It was the total corruption of a sacred paternal bond. He had taken a moment of pure father-son connection and twisted it into the instrument of my destruction. I looked away from the paper, fighting the sharp, acidic sting of grief burning in my throat. I had raised a parasite who fed on the very lessons I had given him to survive. Every curve of that forged ink was a testament to his ultimate failure as a man. Gallagher did not wait for my emotional recovery. He immediately reached for his sleek desk phone, his face hardened into a mask of righteous, legal fury. He stated that forging a power of attorney to secure a massive loan across state banking lines constituted aggravated federal wire fraud. He was prepared to bypass local law enforcement entirely and contact his direct liaison at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A federal indictment would result in immediate asset freezes, dawn raids, and mandatory minimum prison sentences for both Cameron and Haley. He dialed the first 3 digits of the FBI field office. I reached across the mahogany desk and pressed my hand firmly down on the receiver, cutting the connection abruptly. Gallagher looked at me, completely stunned by my physical intervention. I instructed him to stand down. Detonating the legal explosives right now would certainly send them to prison, but it would also give them an immediate target to fight against. Criminals thrive on conflict because it distracts them from the reality of their failure. I needed them to believe their malicious campaign had succeeded flawlessly. I needed Cameron to feel the immense relief of paying off his violent bookies. I needed Haley to feel secure in her freshly funded luxury lifestyle. You do not destroy a structurally unsound building while the occupants are bracing for an earthquake. You let them host a grand celebration on the top floor, and then you quietly remove the foundational pillars. I told Gallagher to file the evidence away and prepare the trust documents for the final maneuver. Let them spend the stolen money. Let them dig their graves so deep that absolutely no legal maneuver could ever pull them out. I drove back to the house, slipping seamlessly back into my role as the defeated, deteriorating old man. The weekend passed in heavy, suffocating silence. Cameron and Haley avoided my gaze entirely, whispering in the kitchen and clinking glasses of imported wine to celebrate their secret financial victory. They believed the $100,000 loan had completely stabilized their crumbling world. I spent Sunday night quietly packing a single duffel bag in the dark, preparing for the imminent collapse of their false kingdom. Early Monday morning, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the front hallway. I opened the heavy oak door to find a stern woman in a gray business suit clutching a thick clipboard. She flashed a government badge and identified herself as an investigator for Adult Protective Services. She did not ask to come inside. She looked at me with cold, evaluating eyes and stated she was responding to an emergency mandate. Haley had filed a formal, sworn affidavit with the state overnight. The report detailed a fabricated incident where I had allegedly become violently disoriented and physically threatened her life with a kitchen knife. They were escalating the war from financial theft directly to an involuntary psychiatric hold. The stern woman pushed past me into the foyer, her wet shoes squeaking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She held her thick clipboard tightly against her chest like a tactical shield, her posture radiating defensive authority. I closed the front door, shutting out the biting morning wind and the relentless rhythm of the rain, and followed her into the living room. Haley was sprawled across the center of the expensive leather sofa. Her performance was already in full swing. She clutched a decorative throw pillow tightly to her chest, her narrow shoulders heaving with violent manufactured sobs. Her makeup was deliberately smeared beneath her eyes to simulate hours of absolute terror and emotional collapse. Cameron stood rigidly beside her, his hand resting heavily on her back in a display of protective solidarity, though his eyes darted nervously toward me the moment I entered the room. The social worker took a seat in the armchair opposite the sofa and clicked her pen with a sharp, echoing snap. She spoke to Haley in a hushed, soothing tone entirely reserved for traumatized victims of abuse. Haley choked back a fake sob, wiped her nose with the back of her trembling hand, and launched into her rehearsed testimony. She claimed that I had completely lost my grip on reality the previous evening. She described in vivid, terrifying detail how I had wandered into the kitchen, grabbed a heavy 8-inch chef's knife from the wooden butcher block, and aggressively cornered her against the granite island. She testified that my eyes were completely vacant, that I did not recognize her at all, and that I had explicitly threatened to cut her throat if she tried to call the police for help. She paused to bury her face in her hands, letting the sheer horror of her fabricated story hang heavily in the silent room. Cameron immediately chimed in, eagerly corroborating every single lie. He solemnly informed the social worker that my cognitive decline had reached a critical violent stage and that I was now in immediate physical danger to everyone residing in the house. The social worker finished transcribing Haley's malicious fiction onto her official government forms. She drew a hard, definitive line across the bottom of the page and turned her sharp gaze directly toward me. The comforting, empathetic tone she had just used with my daughter-in-law evaporated instantly. She looked at me not as a homeowner and certainly not as a father, but as a severe, volatile liability that needed to be contained immediately. She stood up, adjusting her gray suit jacket, and delivered her absolute mandate. She informed me that based on the sworn testimonies of my family members and the immediate threat of lethal physical violence, she was officially removing me from the premises. She commanded me to walk into my bedroom and pack a small overnight bag with basic necessities. I was being remanded to a state-run temporary psychiatric shelter for a mandatory 72-hour evaluation. If I refused to cooperate voluntarily, she stated clearly that she would radio for police backup to physically restrain and transport me. Cameron let out a long, shaky breath of immense relief. Haley peeked through her trembling fingers, her fake tears temporarily parting to reveal a look of pure, venomous triumph. They truly believed the hammer had finally fallen. They believed I was minutes away from being locked inside a padded room, leaving my entire estate utterly defenseless against their ongoing theft. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with the social worker or accuse my son of blatant perjury. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool cardigan and slowly social worker and calmly informed her that a man dealing with severe memory loss requires extensive technological assistance to keep track of his daily routine. I explained that on the exact same day I replaced the exterior locks to protect my property from unauthorized entry. I also installed a comprehensive network of motion-activated micro-cameras throughout the interior of the house. I tapped the secure application icon on the screen. The network took a brief moment to buffer before displaying a grid of high-definition video feeds covering the kitchen, the hallways, and the living room. I selected the main kitchen feed, dialed the timestamp back to the exact hour of Haley's alleged knife attack, and turned the screen toward the social worker. The crisp, high-definition video began to play. The digital timestamp glowed clearly in the top corner of the screen, perfectly matching the hour Haley claimed she was fighting for her life against a deranged old man. The footage showed the sprawling kitchen completely devoid of any homicidal threats. Haley was entirely alone in the room. She was not cowering against the granite island or begging for her life. She was standing firmly in the center of the floor, holding a heavy stack of ceramic dinner plates. The social worker watched in absolute stunned silence as the digital version of Haley calmly and deliberately hurled the plates against the far wall. The ceramic shattered into jagged pieces, raining down across the hardwood floor. The hidden microphone captured the sharp, crashing audio perfectly. After destroying the dishes, Haley walked directly over to the reflective surface of the stainless steel refrigerator. She leaned in close to the appliance, intently studying her own reflection. She spent the next 3 minutes meticulously smearing her mascara with a damp paper towel and practicing a series of panicked, hyperventilating sobs. She repeated the fake crying multiple times, adjusting the pitch and intensity of her wails until she achieved the exact desperate performance she had just delivered on my living room sofa. She was rehearsing her own victimhood with the cold, calculating precision of a seasoned stage actor. I let the video play until the very end, allowing the undeniable audio of her practicing fake shrieks to echo off the walls of the silent living room. I tapped the screen, pausing the video on a clear, undeniable frame of Haley smiling at her own reflection just before the police had arrived the night before. I handed the tablet directly to the government investigator. The social worker stared at the frozen image on the glowing screen. The color rapidly drained from her face, immediately replaced by a dark flush of absolute consuming fury. She had dedicated her entire career to protecting truly vulnerable people, and she realized instantly that she had been used as a pawn in a malicious, calculated extortion plot. She slammed the tablet down onto the glass coffee table and aggressively shoved her official forms back into her leather briefcase. She glared down at Haley, her voice vibrating with intense professional rage. She explicitly informed my daughter-in-law that filing a fraudulent claim of physical abuse to manipulate state resources was a severe criminal offense. She promised to forward the video evidence directly to the district attorney for immediate prosecution. As the social worker marched purposefully toward the front door, the entire illusion of control evaporated. The realization that they were entirely exposed, completely out of money, and now facing imminent arrest shattered the last remaining fragments of Cameron's sanity. He let out a raw, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated desperation. He vaulted over the coffee table, his hands outstretched and curled into claws aiming directly for my throat. Cameron's heavy frame collided violently with my chest, driving me backward against the rigid edge of the leather armchair. His fingers locked into the thick fabric of my wool cardigan, twisting the material so tightly it restricted the air in my windpipe. I reached up and gripped his forearms, feeling the frantic, erratic pulse of a man entirely unhinged by the sudden, spectacular collapse of his own criminal architecture. His eyes were completely bloodshot, bulging with a feral, cornered panic that erased every last trace of the son I had raised for 35 years. Decades of ingrained paternal respect evaporated in a single instant of raw, desperate violence. He shook me aggressively, spittle flying from his lips, as he demanded that I run after the social worker that I call her, back to the house, and voluntarily surrender myself to the state psychiatric ward. He roared that my stubbornness was deliberately destroying his life by refusing to comply with his fabricated dementia narrative. I did not strike him back. I planted my feet firmly on the polished hardwood floor and stood my ground, absorbing the physical assault like a stone breakwater absorbing a turbulent tide. I stared directly into his frantic, erratic eyes, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of my fear. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the teenager I had taught to drive the young man whose college tuition I had funded by working double shifts at the construction site, was entirely gone. In his place stood a hollow, violent addict who viewed my physical existence as the only obstacle standing between him and survival. He yanked my collar harder, his knuckles digging painfully into my collarbone, attempting to exert a physical dominance he had never truly earned. He was trying to break me with brute force because his psychological manipulations had completely and publicly failed. When physical intimidation failed to elicit my submission, Cameron pivoted instantly to the most toxic form of emotional extortion available to him. He released his aggressive grip on my throat slightly, letting his hands slide down to clutch my shoulders. His voice broke into a high-pitched, agonizing whine. He invoked the name of my deceased wife. He screamed that Brenda would be absolutely disgusted by my sheer cruelty toward her only child. He weaponized the memory of the woman I had loved for 4 decades, hurling her name at me like a jagged stone to inflict maximum emotional trauma. He claimed that his mother had always been the forgiving parent, the woman who understood boundless grace, and that she would never abandon her flesh and blood to violent criminals over a simple financial mistake. The audacity of his words poisoned the air in the living room. He was actively using a dead woman's unconditional love to shield himself from the brutal, impending consequences of his own criminal gambling habits. His legs gave out completely. He sank to his knees on the expensive Persian rug, clutching the fabric of my trousers with trembling hands. He begged me to sign the deed of the house over to him immediately. He confessed everything in a rapid, pathetic torrent of overlapping words, completely forgetting that the state investigator had just left to contact the district attorney regarding his felony fraud. He admitted he owed exactly $60,000 to a syndicate of ruthless sports bookies operating in the city's underbelly. He sobbed uncontrollably, stating that the absolute deadline for payment was only days away. The enforcers had explicitly promised to shatter both of his kneecaps with steel pipes if the debt remained unpaid. He pleaded that my house was his only remaining lifeline. He demanded that I sacrifice the sanctuary Brenda and I had built from the ground up to pay off his illegal wagers. He insisted it was my fundamental duty as a father to save his life completely, ignoring the horrifying fact that he had just spent weeks meticulously plotting to end mine in a locked psychiatric asylum. I placed my hands flat against Cameron's chest and shoved him backward with a surge of hardened, unforgiving strength. He tumbled across the rug, landing awkwardly against the wooden base of the sofa. I stood towering over him, my breathing perfectly controlled. I did not yell. I spoke with a lethal, icy precision that pierced directly through his pathetic, continuous sobbing. I ordered him to never speak his mother's name in my presence again. I stated unequivocally that Brenda had dedicated her entire life to raising a child with honor, working late hours at the bakery to ensure he never went without, not a cowardly criminal who would eagerly steal the roof over his own father's head to cover a bad sports bet. I walked over to the mahogany side table and picked up the black velvet box I had retrieved from the dingy pawn shop on the extreme south side of the city. I threw the box directly at his chest. The velvet casing bounced off his shirt and hit the floor, snapping open to reveal the empty interior. I pulled the yellow carbon copy pawn slip from my pocket and dropped it on his lap. I informed him that I had already visited his preferred pawnbroker. I knew exactly how he and his wife had liquidated Brenda's custom diamond necklace for a fraction of its true value to appease street thugs. I told him that his mother's grace was entirely reserved for people who possessed a functioning conscience. I looked down at my son and stated clearly that he was no longer my financial burden, nor was he my legal responsibility. He had created his own violent debt, and he would have to face the bookie's steel pipes standing on his own 2 feet. Cameron scrambled backward, pressing his spine tightly against the leather sofa. His mouth opened and closed in silent, absolute horror as the realization of his inescapable doom finally washed over his features. I turned my back on his pathetic display and walked steadily up the stairs to my bedroom, locking the door firmly behind me. The house settled into a tense, suffocating quiet for the remainder of the evening. I sat in my armchair in the dark, monitoring the live video feeds from the hidden microcameras on my digital tablet. The silence broke shortly after 2 in the morning. The high-definition camera positioned in the upstairs hallway captured Haley creeping out of the guest bedroom. She was holding a heavy wrench and a pair of industrial pipe cutters she had scavenged from my basement workbench. I watched the screen intently as she slipped quietly into the main upstairs bathroom. She did not turn on the overhead light. She knelt beside the vanity cabinet and crawled underneath the porcelain sink. The sensitive audio feed picked up the distinct metallic grinding of heavy tools gripping brass fixtures. She was intentionally severing the primary water line. Minutes later, the camera in the downstairs living room caught the first signs of her desperate, unhinged sabotage. A dark, spreading stain blossomed across the pristine white ceiling directly above the antique rug. Filthy, pressurized water began leaking heavily through the drywall, dripping down to systematically ruin the interior of the home she could no longer steal. The steady, rhythmic dripping of water striking the polished oak floorboards echoed through the silent house like a ticking clock. By dawn, the antique Persian rug in the living room was completely saturated, transformed into a heavy, ruined sponge of filthy brown liquid. The unmistakable acrid stench of wet drywall and stagnant pipe water permeated the entire first floor. I sat calmly in my armchair watching the destruction unfold with calculated patience. Footsteps pounded down the wooden staircase. Haley burst into the living room, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. She gasped loudly, covering her mouth as she stared at the sagging, discolored bulge expanding rapidly across the pristine ceiling. She immediately launched into a frantic, hysterical tirade. She pointed at the cascading water and screamed that the structural integrity of the house was completely failing. She claimed the property was a deadly hazard, a decaying ruin completely unfit for human habitation. Cameron rushed in behind her, splashing his bare feet into the spreading puddle. He looked up at the ceiling, his jaw dropping in genuine shock, entirely unaware of his wife's midnight sabotage. Haley grabbed his arm, her voice rising to a frantic, piercing pitch. She demanded that we all pack our bags and evacuate the premises immediately. She insisted they needed to secure emergency luxury hotel accommodations using my credit cards before the ceiling collapsed and killed us all. She was attempting to use the catastrophic water damage as a final desperate lever to force me out of my fortress. She planned to drain my accounts under the guise of an unavoidable domestic crisis. I did not move from my chair. I simply watched the dirty water pool around her expensive slippers, waiting for the trap to spring. A sharp, authoritative knock at the front door interrupted Haley's theatrical panic. Before Cameron could move, I stood up, walked deliberately through the expanding perimeter of dirty water, and unbolted the door. Attorney Gallagher stood on the porch, his posture rigid, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit that starkly contrasted the humid, decaying atmosphere of my foyer. He stepped inside without hesitation. He did not flinch at the sight of the ruined ceiling. He did not acknowledge the steady rain of pipe water splashing mere inches from his polished leather shoes. His eyes locked directly onto Cameron and Haley with the predatory focus of a hawk tracking cornered prey. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. He walked right past me, his footsteps echoing wetly on the soaked wood, and stopped directly in front of my son. He held the envelope out. Cameron stared at it, his hands trembling, instinctively recognizing the lethal weight of legal documentation. When Cameron refused to take it, Gallagher let the envelope drop flat onto the kitchen island with a heavy, definitive slap. He announced clearly that he was officially serving them with a formal, non-negotiable 30-day notice of eviction. Gallagher stated that their physical presence on the property was no longer authorized, tolerated, or legally protected. He detailed the strict parameters of the notice with mechanical precision. They had exactly 1 month to collect their personal belongings and vacate the premises entirely. If they remained on the property beyond the stroke of midnight on the 30th day, they would be subjected to immediate physical removal by armed county sheriffs. The color drained entirely from Haley's face. The master manipulator who had just destroyed a central water line to force a temporary evacuation was suddenly paralyzed by the reality of a mandatory, legally enforced, and permanent exile. She looked at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. The safety net they had so desperately tried to weave out of my assets was being systematically dismantled right in front of them. Cameron snatched the manila envelope off the wet granite counter, his chest heaved with rapid, erratic breaths. In a surge of blind, impotent rage, he ripped the thick document in half, then tore it again, throwing the shredded pieces directly into the puddle of filthy water accumulating on the floor. He screamed that the eviction was a meaningless legal bluff. He pounded his fist against his chest, loudly declaring that he was the sole blood heir to the estate. He roared that the house was his birthright, his guaranteed inheritance, and that absolutely no lawyer could legally banish a son from his own father's property. Gallagher did not raise his voice. He offered a cold, razor-thin smile that sent a visible shudder down Cameron's spine. He calmly informed my son that tearing up a piece of paper did not alter the concrete reality of state property law. He clarified that the house no longer belonged to Germain as an individual. He revealed that every single asset, including the physical structure surrounding them, the land it sat on, and the bank accounts tied to it, had been legally transferred into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. He explained that Cameron was entirely stripped of his inheritance rights, possessing zero legal claim to the property or the equity. Gallagher delivered the final devastating blow with surgical precision. He stated that in the eyes of the law, Cameron and Haley were not heirs, they were not family members, and they were not tenants. They were legally classified as hostile squatters occupying private property without a valid lease. The crushing reality of their situation collapsed around them like the decaying ceiling above. Cameron fell backward against the counter, his mind fracturing under the sheer weight of the impending bookie deadline and his newly minted squatter status. He had no money, no leverage, and no home to leverage. Haley recognized instantly that her grand illusion of untouchable wealth was utterly dead. The loan sharks would be coming for the $60,000, and Cameron no longer possessed the resources to shield her from the violent fallout. She turned on her heel and retreated rapidly up the stairs, ignoring the water cascading down the steps. She locked herself inside the master bathroom, her hands shaking violently as she pulled an untraceable burner phone from the bottom of her designer makeup bag. Driven into an absolute corner by the looming eviction and the imminent threat of underworld violence, she bypassed traditional legal avenues entirely. She scrolled through an encrypted messaging application and dialed a heavily guarded number. She placed a desperate, frantic call to a black market real estate broker offering to illegally liquidate the entire estate's remaining assets for pennies on the dollar before the 30-day deadline expired. The diner was a neon-lit relic on the industrial edge of town, far removed from the manicured lawns of my neighborhood. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth opposite private investigator Ramirez. The air smelled of stale coffee and fried grease. Ramirez did not offer a greeting. He pushed a sleek digital audio player across the laminate table and handed me a pair of heavy headphones. I placed them over my ears. Ramirez pressed a button, and the crisp, intercepted audio of Haley's frantic voice filled my head. She was speaking with a known black market real estate broker, a shadow operator who specialized in rapid, off-the-books liquidations. The desperation in her tone was palpable, thick with the terror of the impending $60,000 debt to the illegal bookies. She explicitly offered to sell my estate for a fraction of its market value, demanding an immediate cash transaction. The broker questioned her legal authority to execute a sale on a property not in her name. Haley's response was chillingly confident. She assured him she held a fully notarized, comprehensive power of attorney that granted her absolute control over the property transfer. She was openly planning to use the exact same forged document Cameron had utilized for the second mortgage. She intended to finalize the fraudulent sale and vanish with the cash long before the 30-day eviction deadline could be enforced by the county sheriff. Ramirez paused the recording and looked at me over the rim of his coffee mug. He asked if I wanted him to forward the intercepted audio directly to the local police department to halt the transaction. The immediate legal impulse would be to stop the crime before it happened. I shook my head and handed the headphones back. I told him to let the transaction proceed without any interference. Blocking the sale would simply push Haley into a deeper, darker corner of the criminal underworld. If I stopped her now, she would only find a more destructive avenue to secure the money she desperately needed to appease the loan sharks. I left the diner and drove directly to Attorney Gallagher's downtown office. The morning traffic moved sluggishly, giving me ample time to formulate the absolute destruction of my daughter-in-law's grand illusion. I walked into Gallagher's suite and presented Ramirez's findings. Gallagher immediately reached for his phone to draft a cease and desist order, but I placed my hand firmly over his. I instructed him to pivot our strategy entirely. We were not going to prevent Haley from committing real estate fraud. We were going to facilitate it on a massive, federally documented scale. I directed Gallagher to establish an anonymous corporate shell company by the end of the business day. This untraceable entity would act as the eager, flush-with-cash buyer Haley was so desperately seeking. We would use the liquid assets from my secure offshore accounts to front the purchase money. Gallagher stared at me, his sharp legal mind instantly calculating the sheer magnitude of the trap. By allowing Haley to legally sign closing documents using a forged power of attorney to sell a property that already belonged to an irrevocable trust, she would be committing multiple federal felonies simultaneously. She would be crossing the threshold from simple local theft into aggravated federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. The paperwork would require her physical signature in front of licensed witnesses, creating an irrefutable, completely documented chain of criminal evidence. Gallagher nodded slowly, a dark smile spreading across his face as he grasped the lethal elegance of the maneuver. He immediately contacted a trusted corporate liaison to expedite the creation of the shell company. He drafted a flawless, highly aggressive cash offer that would be irresistible to a woman staring down the barrel of underworld violence. The trap was meticulously constructed, entirely legal from our side, and absolutely devastating for hers. We were handing her the shovel, and she was eagerly preparing to dig her own permanent grave. I wanted them to experience the absolute high of a perceived victory right before the floor was completely removed from beneath their feet. The illusion of success is the most intoxicating poison you can feed a narcissist. I returned to the house to find the atmosphere radically transformed. The suffocating dread that had plagued Cameron and Haley since the delivery of the eviction notice was entirely gone. Haley was practically vibrating with manic energy, strutting across the ruined living room floor as if she had just conquered the world. She was tossing her expensive designer clothing into large moving boxes with theatrical flair, her face flushed with the intoxicating thrill of her perceived victory. The hidden audio sensors captured her loud, boastful phone call perfectly. She had dialed her parents, the Harpers, the aristocratic pillars of the local country club. She paced back and forth, her voice echoing off the water-stained walls, bragging outrageously about a brilliant, highly lucrative real estate transaction she had just orchestrated. She lied with effortless grace, claiming she had masterfully liquidated an underperforming asset and secured a massive cash windfall that would easily launch Cameron's new business ventures. She completely omitted the looming threat of the bookie's steel pipes and the impending eviction. Instead, she spun a narrative of unparalleled financial genius. She loudly invited her parents over for a grand celebratory toast to commemorate the closing of the deal. She wanted her wealthy family to witness her ultimate triumph to validate her status as a high society power player. Cameron stood near the kitchen island, his posture slightly slumped but his face displaying a cowardly relief. He was willing to ride the coattails of his wife's federal crimes as long as it kept his kneecaps intact. They were basking in the warmth of a burning building, utterly convinced they had outsmarted me one final time. I sat quietly in the adjacent room, listening to her arrogant laughter, knowing the precise hour of their absolute destruction was rapidly approaching. The morning of the scheduled closing arrived with crisp, deceptive brightness. Haley had spared no expense for her final performance. She had arranged an elaborate spread on the dining room table, complete with crystal flutes and a chilled bottle of imported vintage champagne. She wore a sharp-tailored business suit projecting the image of a seasoned executive ready to finalize a multi-million-dollar acquisition. Cameron paced nervously near the window, his eyes darting toward the street, sweating profusely despite the cool air in the house. He knew the illegal bookies were waiting for their payment by nightfall. The heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded exactly at noon, echoing through the quiet house like a judge's gavel. Haley smoothed her jacket, a victorious smile stretching across her face, and glided toward the entryway. She swung the heavy oak door open to reveal a tall, imposing man in a dark suit. He carried a thick leather briefcase securely handcuffed to his wrist. He introduced himself as the official representative of the purchasing corporation. Haley's eyes locked onto the leather briefcase, practically devouring the promised salvation hidden inside. The final act of her criminal masterpiece was about to commence. The downstairs living room had been meticulously restored from its previous state of waterlogged decay, at least cosmetically. Haley had hired an emergency cleaning crew to mask the harsh odor of damp drywall, replacing the ruined antique Persian rug with a cheap, visually deceptive synthetic replica. She flitted around the glass coffee table with arrogant grace, pouring expensive vintage champagne into tall crystal flutes. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harper, sat comfortably on the freshly delivered accent chairs, exuding the smug, entitled aura of aristocrats witnessing their lineage succeed. Arthur Harper wore a tailored navy suit, occasionally checking a heavy gold watch, clearly impatient but eager to celebrate this supposed financial masterstroke. Beside him, his wife offered approving, slow nods to Haley, entirely validating the elaborate fiction her daughter had spun. Cameron stood near the large bay window, frantically adjusting and readjusting the knot of his silk tie. He wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. The illegal bookies were demanding their $60,000 by sundown, and the pressure radiating from his rigid posture was absolute. Sitting perfectly still at the center of this domestic theater was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a charcoal suit. He was the black market real estate broker. In reality, he was a trusted corporate associate contracted directly by Attorney Gallagher, representing the untraceable shell corporation we had funded just 48 hours prior. He played his part with flawless, icy professionalism. He snapped the latches of his heavy leather briefcase open, the sharp metallic clicks cutting through the light classical music Haley had playing in the background. He extracted a thick stack of legal documents and laid them squarely on the center of the glass table. These were the fraudulent closing papers transferring ownership of my entire estate in exchange for a massive immediate cash payout. The trap was laid bare under the bright morning sunlight, waiting for the final fatal misstep. Haley stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with undisguised greed as she stared at the thick stack of contracts. She handed a heavy silver fountain pen directly to Cameron. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the polished glass. The sheer magnitude of the felony he was about to commit weighed heavily against whatever fragile shreds of conscience he had left. But the terrifying image of loan sharks waiting in the city shadows to shatter his legs overpowered his hesitation. He gripped the silver barrel of the pen and leaned heavily over the table. The undercover broker pointed a manicured finger at the primary signature line, instructing Cameron that he must sign exactly as the authorized legal proxy for Germain, utilizing the forged power of attorney. Cameron nodded sharply, swallowed hard, and pressed the nib against the pristine white paper. He executed the signature, perfectly replicating the exact fatherly lesson I had taught him 2 decades ago in a cramped suburban kitchen. He signed my name, effectively selling the house I had built with my own hands to a shadow corporation for pennies on the dollar. He flipped to the next page and signed again. Then the next. He initialed the riders, the liability waivers, and the final deed transfer. With every stroke of the pen, he cemented multiple counts of aggravated federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny into the permanent legal record. Haley stood over his shoulder, practically vibrating with triumphant energy. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the crystal champagne flute, her mind already spending the illicit cash on high society masquerades. Mr. Harper offered a loud, booming laugh, congratulating his son-in-law on executing such a swift and decisive liquidation of an underperforming asset. Cameron finished the final document, capped the silver pen, and pushed the stack of papers back across the glass table. The broker collected the documents, meticulously checking every forged signature and initial to ensure the criminal chain of evidence was absolutely airtight. Finding the paperwork flawless, he offered a cold, practiced nod. He reached down into the depths of his open briefcase to retrieve the promised banded stacks of $100 bills. The atmosphere in the room spiked with intoxicating, arrogant relief. Cameron exhaled a deep, shuddering breath, believing his life was finally saved. Haley raised her glass, preparing to offer a toast to her own malicious genius. The heavy brass deadbolt of the front door clicked loudly, slicing through the celebratory cheer like a gunshot. I pushed the oak door open and stepped firmly into the foyer. Attorney Gallagher flanked my right side, holding a thick leather folio, his face a mask of predatory legal calculation. Private Investigator Ramirez flanked my left, his posture rigid and commanding. We marched in unison toward the living room, our heavy footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. The smug smiles vanished instantly from the faces of Cameron and Haley. The champagne flute slipped from Haley's grasp, hitting the synthetic rug with a dull thud, spilling expensive wine across her pristine shoes. Cameron froze entirely, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically between me and the broker sitting at the table. Mr. Harper immediately stood up, his face flushing a deep, indignant crimson. He puffed out his chest, attempting to assert the aristocratic dominance he used to bully subordinates at his country club. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face and loudly demanded to know what I was doing, interrupting his daughter's private business transaction. He yelled that I was trespassing on an active closing and threatened to call the police to have me physically removed from the premises. He ordered me to step out of the house immediately and let the young adults finish their financial restructuring without my pathetic, senile interference. He was entirely blind to the catastrophic reality rapidly unfolding around him. I did not flinch at his booming voice. I did not acknowledge his entitled outrage. I kept my gaze locked squarely on the pale, terrified face of my son. I reached backward without breaking eye contact and turned the brass deadbolt on the front door, locking us all inside the house. The heavy metallic click echoed loudly, sealing the room like a concrete vault. I walked deliberately past the sputtering, furious Mr. Harper, completely ignoring his aggressive posture. I stopped directly in front of the glass coffee table standing opposite the undercover broker who had just secured the forged contracts. Attorney Gallagher stepped forward and handed me the thick leather folio. I raised the massive federal file high in the air and dropped it squarely onto the center of the glass table. The heavy binder landed right next to the freshly signed fraudulent closing documents with a concussive smack that rattled the remaining crystal champagne flutes. The file contained the complete, undeniable catalog of their crimes. It held the high-definition recordings of their extortion plots, the forged bank statements, the illegal power of attorney, and the official documentation proving the shell company buyer was entirely funded by my own offshore accounts. The arrogant bluster instantly drained from Mr. Harper. The room went completely suffocatingly dead quiet. The undercover broker, instantly recognizing the lethal architecture of a federal sting operation, did not utter a single syllable in defense of his clients. He slowly withdrew his manicured hands from the glass table, snapped the heavy latches of his leather briefcase shut, and took 3 deliberate steps backward toward the foyer. His silent retreat signaled the absolute and irreversible collapse of Haley's fraudulent real estate transaction. I stepped forward into the void he left behind and flipped open the heavy cover of the federal file. I did not raise my voice to match the escalating tension in the room. I let the undeniable weight of the physical evidence speak for itself. I spread the documents across the polished glass, creating a meticulous mosaic of their undeniable guilt right before their eyes. First, I laid down the bright yellow carbon copy of the pawnshop receipt, clearly displaying Haley's own signature authorizing the liquidation of Brenda's custom diamond necklace for pennies on the dollar. Next to it, I placed the high-resolution prints of the forged bank checks and the illegally obtained power of attorney with the fraudulent notary stamp glowing crimson against the stark white paper. I followed this with the certified copy of the fake medical evaluation Cameron had attempted to use to lock me inside a psychiatric ward just days prior. Finally, I tossed down a series of glossy 8x10 photographs captured by the hidden micro cameras. The images displayed Haley in crisp, undeniable high definition kneeling beneath the upstairs bathroom sink, with a heavy pipe cutter maliciously severing the main water line to deliberately sabotage the property. The visual timeline of their criminality was laid out with surgical precision, leaving absolutely no room for denial, fabricated excuses, or further psychological manipulation. Mr. Harper leaned forward, his wide eyes tracking across the undeniable photographic evidence and the blatantly forged legal documents. The aggressive, aristocratic red flush drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a sickly, ashen pallor of total defeat. Mrs. Harper clutched the armrest of her synthetic accent chair, her jaw trembling violently as the grand illusion of her daughter's high society success disintegrated into the sordid reality of common, desperate criminality. The Harpers were powerful pillars of the local country club individuals who traded solely on pristine reputation and untouchable social standing. Now they were staring at the cold, hard proof that their daughter was a malicious felon orchestrating massive real estate fraud to pay off illegal gambling syndicates. The total destruction of their arrogant facade was immediate, visceral, and absolute. Mr. Harper looked at Haley not with paternal pride, but with a profound, unadulterated disgust that stripped away the last remaining layers of her confidence. The silence in the room stretched until it became physically agonizing. Cameron could not endure the suffocating weight of his total exposure. His breathing turned ragged and heavily erratic. Driven by the primal, thoughtless panic of a cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut, he let out a raw, guttural roar. He lunged recklessly across the ruined synthetic rug, his hands outstretched in a desperate, foolish attempt to snatch the federal file and destroy the evidence before anyone else could read it. He never even made it past the edge of the glass table. Private Investigator Ramirez moved with blinding, calculated speed. He stepped fluidly into Cameron's path, pivoting his weight and driving his heavy boot in a brutal, sweeping arc against Cameron's leading leg. The sickening sound of impact echoed sharply through the quiet room. Cameron's feet flew entirely out from beneath him, his forward momentum instantly neutralized. He crashed violently onto the hardwood floor, his shoulder striking the solid wood with a heavy concussive thud. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a wheezing gasp as he writhed on the ground, completely incapacitated. Ramirez stood directly over him, his posture relaxed but radiating lethal authority, ensuring the pathetic attempt at physical violence was permanently ended. Haley stared at her husband writhing in agony on the floor, then looked back at the horrified, condemning faces of her wealthy parents. The base survival instinct of a cornered parasite took over entirely. She did not drop to her knees to check on Cameron. She did not offer a single word of defense or spousal solidarity. Instead, she took a rapid step backward, distancing herself physically and morally from the man she had actively conspired with for months. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at Cameron's heaving chest and unleashed a rapid torrent of hysterical accusations. She screamed that she was an innocent, terrified victim of his degenerate gambling addiction. She wailed to her parents that Cameron had physically threatened her, forcing her to forge the bank documents, destroy the water pipes, and contact the black market broker under severe emotional and physical duress. She painted a frantic, entirely fabricated narrative where Cameron was a violent mastermind who had manipulated her every move to save his own legs from the loan sharks. Cameron gasped for air, his face contorted in physical pain and utter betrayal as he listened to his wife throw him directly to the wolves. He managed to push himself up onto one elbow, staring at her with wide, disbelieving eyes as she systematically dismantled their marriage to save her own skin. The vows they had taken, the luxurious life they had funded with stolen money, disintegrated instantly in the cold, unforgiving light of impending prosecution. She was actively willing to condemn him to decades in federal prison if it meant she could preserve a fraction of her ruined social reputation. Before Mr. Harper could formulate a response to his daughter's frantic stream of lies, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the heavy, toxic atmosphere of the living room. It started as a distant wail, rapidly multiplying and intensifying until it completely drowned out Haley's hysterical, pleading screams. Through the large bay window, the quiet suburban street erupted into organized chaos. The blinding, strobing flash of red and blue emergency lights washed violently over the walls of the living room, casting frantic, erratic shadows across the terrified faces of everyone trapped inside. Multiple heavy police cruisers aggressively jumped the curb, blocking the driveway entirely and boxing in the black market broker's vehicle. The deafening wail of the sirens surrounded the property from every angle, signaling the absolute and inescapable end of the line. Attorney Gallagher stepped casually toward the window, looking out at the arriving tactical units with a cold, deeply satisfied smile. He turned his gaze back to the ruined couple on the floor and calmly announced that the final trap was officially closed. The heavy gold-plated pen in Arthur Harper's breast pocket suddenly felt like a useless trinket against the crushing weight of a federal indictment. He looked at his daughter, the supposed prodigy of their elite social circle, and saw only a desperate criminal cornered by her own boundless greed. He realized instantly that a public trial would obliterate the Harper name. The country club whispers would inevitably turn into front-page corporate scandals. His pristine legacy was on the verge of total, irreversible annihilation. He swallowed his disgust, reverting to the only survival tactic men of his pedigree truly understood. He reached inside his tailored navy suit jacket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound checkbook. His hands shook slightly as he uncapped his pen. He did not apologize for his daughter's actions. He did not express remorse for the sheer cruelty inflicted upon me or the violent betrayal orchestrated in my own home. Instead, he treated my suffering as a simple administrative error requiring a rapid financial remedy. He looked me directly in the eye, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial, desperate whisper. He offered to write a blank check right there on the spot. He promised to pay double the amount of the property's current market value to cover all property damages, all legal fees, and to fully compensate the inconvenience of the ordeal. He pleaded that we could resolve this quietly, privately, as gentlemen. He insisted that involving the federal authorities would only result in a messy, prolonged public spectacle that benefited no one. He begged me to drop the criminal charges and let his family walk away with their social standing intact, utterly convinced that enough zeros on a piece of paper could erase months of targeted elder abuse and fraud. I watched the dark ink from Mr. Harper's gold pen begin to stain the pristine surface of his checkbook. He extended the trembling piece of paper toward me, treating the financial offering as an absolute shield against the severe consequences of his daughter's depravity. I reached out and took the check from his outstretched fingers. I did not look at the numbers he had hurriedly scribbled across the line. I gripped the thick, expensive paper firmly between my hands and ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp tearing sound sliced through the suffocating silence of the room. I tore it again, dropping the shredded pieces directly onto the forged real estate contracts sitting on the glass table. I looked Arthur Harper dead in the eye and spoke with a hardened, uncompromising clarity. I told him that my dignity, my home, and the legacy I had built with my own hands through decades of grueling labor were not commodities priced for wealthy white socialites to purchase whenever their moral compass failed. I stated unequivocally that his money held absolutely no power in my house. He could not buy his way out of federal felonies, and he could not purchase a clean conscience for a daughter who had eagerly plotted to lock me in a state psychiatric ward to steal my assets. His arrogant assumption that my suffering was simply a brutal negotiation tactic was deeply, profoundly offensive. I informed him that the Harper reputation was already completely dead buried beneath the crushing weight of his own daughter's limitless greed. Before Mr. Harper could formulate a sputtered, indignant defense, the heavy oak front door was violently thrown open. The reinforced frame shuddered against the drywall as a highly coordinated team of armed federal officers breached the foyer. They moved with absolute tactical precision, their heavy boots pounding against the hardwood floor. Their dark tactical gear and drawn weapons completely shattered the last remaining illusions of country club civility. Attorney Gallagher stepped aside calmly, seamlessly yielding the floor to the federal authorities he had been actively coordinating with for weeks. Private Investigator Ramirez stood tall, pointing directly at the forged documents on the table to secure the chain of physical evidence. The officers swarmed the living room, their commanding voices bouncing off the water-stained walls, ordering everyone to freeze and keep their hands clearly visible. The sterile, untouchable bubble of elite privilege had officially popped. Two federal officers moved instantly toward Cameron and Haley, completely ignoring the luxurious surroundings. The metallic, unmistakable click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Cameron's wrists. He offered zero physical resistance. His broad shoulders slumped completely forward in an act of total surrender. The agonizing realization that he was trading the immediate violent threat of a bookie's steel pipe for the absolute certainty of a concrete federal prison cell washed over his pale features. He kept his eyes glued firmly to the damaged floorboards, entirely incapable of meeting my gaze. A second officer grabbed Haley's wrists, forcing them firmly behind her back. She shrieked, thrashing wildly against the officer's unyielding grip, her expensive business suit wrinkling violently as she fought the restraints. She screamed for her father to do something demanding. He called his elite corporate lawyers to fix the catastrophic legal mess she had orchestrated. The lead federal agent stood firmly in the center of the room and loudly recited their Miranda rights. He systematically listed the formal charges, his voice echoing off the walls: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, real estate fraud, and felony elder abuse. Each specific charge landed like a physical blow against the Harper family legacy. Mr. Harper slowly turned his back on his screaming, thrashing daughter. He methodically buttoned his tailored navy jacket, his face hardening into a mask of absolute, unforgiving disgust. He extended his arm to his wife, guiding her toward the open front door. Mrs. Harper kept her head lowered, her eyes fixed entirely on the floorboards, completely ignoring Haley's desperate, hysterical pleas for intervention. They walked out of my house without a single backward glance, instantly disowning the criminal they had raised. The officers marched Cameron and Haley out through the foyer. The heavy steel doors of the police cruiser slammed shut with a definitive, echoing finality. Through the large bay window, I watched the convoy of flashing red and blue lights slowly pull away from the curb, carrying the dual architects of my attempted destruction into the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. The harsh, piercing wail of the sirens faded gradually into the distance, replaced by the deep, profound quiet of the suburban evening. The neighborhood returned to its typical, undisturbed calm. I stood entirely alone in the center of the living room. The physical remnants of the war were scattered all around me, the shredded bank check resting on the glass table, the forged legal contracts, the cheap synthetic rug masking the floorboards beneath my feet. The house felt massive, empty, and for the first time in months, completely secure. I walked deliberately over to the heavy oak front door, pushed it firmly shut, and engaged the brass deadbolt with a solid click. I turned off the overhead lights, casting the room into a peaceful, undisturbed darkness. I exhaled a long, steady breath. The absolute silence was no longer a threat. Exactly. 7 days after the flashing red and blue lights faded from my suburban street, I found myself sitting in the sterile, windowless confines of a federal holding precinct. The aggressive chill of the air conditioning hummed a monotonous, vibrating drone against the thick concrete walls entirely detached from the warmth of the outside world. The air smelled faintly of industrial floor cleaner and burnt coffee. Across the scarred, bolted-down metal table sat lead Detective Miller, his posture weary but laced with a quiet professional respect. He had spent the entire week meticulously unraveling the tangled, deeply incriminating web of Cameron and Haley's financial sabotage. He informed me that the federal prosecutor was preparing a devastating and airtight case armed with the high-definition audio recordings, the blatantly forged power of attorney, and the sworn testimony of the undercover black market broker. The severity of the charges carried a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary, a reality that had finally broken through my son's arrogant facade. The detective reached into the breast pocket of his wrinkled shirt and produced a folded piece of yellow legal paper. He slid it across the cold metal surface, stopping it precisely an inch from my folded hands. He stated clearly that it was a personal correspondence drafted by my son from his holding cell early that morning. The detective clarified that I was under absolutely no legal obligation to read it, but precinct protocol dictated he deliver the message. I stared down at the folded yellow paper resting on the table. It represented the final desperate gasp of a cornered predator, realizing the trap he built for me had permanently snapped shut on his own legs. I picked up the paper and unfolded it with steady, unhurried hands. Cameron's handwriting was instantly recognizable, yet jagged and frantically pressed into the page, betraying the severe psychological decay of a man who had finally hit concrete rock bottom. He did not open the letter with a shred of genuine accountability. Instead, he immediately launched into a deeply manipulative, highly calculated campaign of weaponized nostalgia. He wrote passionately about his childhood, specifically invoking the sweltering summer afternoons we had spent side by side in our old dusty garage, rebuilding the rusted engine of a salvaged Chevrolet. He painted a vivid, desperate picture of a dutiful son holding the flashlight steady while his father patiently taught him the fundamental value of hard, honest labor. He recalled the exact model of the blue bicycle I had purchased for his 12th birthday, explicitly mentioning the grueling double shifts I had worked at the downtown construction site just to afford it. He was deliberately attempting to resurrect the ghost of an innocent boy who had loved his father, using sacred family memories as a psychological crowbar to pry open my sympathies. The prose then rapidly devolved into pathetic, frantic begging. He pleaded for my mercy, begging me to contact the district attorney and formally retract my cooperation as a primary witness. He swore repeatedly that the looming 10-year federal sentence would completely and permanently destroy his life. He cowardly attempted to shift the entire burden of guilt onto Haley, claiming she had masterfully orchestrated the real estate fraud and ruthlessly manipulated his financial vulnerabilities. He blamed the violent, illegal bookies, citing extreme paralyzing fear for his physical safety as the sole reason he had signed the forged documents in my living room. He begged me to remember the shared blood tying us together, asking for one final miraculous second chance to prove he could be the honorable man I had raised. He was actively trying to buy his freedom using the currency of my paternal grief. I read the final desperate sentence and simply stared at the blue ink smudged across the yellow page. My eyes remained perfectly dry. My breathing did not hitch, and my pulse did not elevate by a single beat. The overwhelming, crushing sorrow that had previously paralyzed my chest when I first realized my son's true nature had completely burned away over the last week. In its place remained a hardened, impenetrable clarity that shielded me from his toxic emotional extortion. The calculated manipulation embedded in the legal paper failed to extract a single ounce of sympathy from my soul. I realized with absolute certainty that true love and family devotion cannot be summoned solely to escape the severe legal consequences of a federal felony. I carefully folded the paper along its original creases, meticulously smoothing the rough edges with my thumb. I slid the document back across the cold metal table toward Detective Miller. I looked the seasoned investigator directly in the eye and spoke with a calm, unwavering conviction. I told him that the sweet, eager boy who had helped me rebuild car engines in the garage had died a very long time ago. I stated clearly that the cowardly, deceitful man currently occupying his holding cell was nothing more than a dangerous, irredeemable stranger. I instructed the detective to submit the letter directly to the federal prosecutor to be used as further evidence of his manipulative, unrepentant character. I completely refused to grant the blind forgiveness Cameron so desperately tried to extort. My lifelong role as his shield and protector had officially concluded. I pushed my heavy chair back from the metal table and stood up. Detective Miller offered a firm, respectful nod, silently acknowledging the immense, unseen weight I had just permanently discarded in his interrogation room. I turned my back on the sterile confines of the precinct and walked steadily down the long, echoing corridor. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The bright, unfiltered sunlight washed over my face, blinding in its intensity, but profoundly warm and comforting. I planted my feet on the concrete sidewalk and inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the fresh, clean breeze. The suffocating toxic gravity of betrayal that had anchored me to the ground for months instantly evaporated into the clear blue sky. The deceptive illusions of blood loyalty, the crushing burden of my son's endless greed, and the lingering ghosts of a corrupted past were entirely, undeniably dead. I walked toward my car with a perfectly straight spine and a clear, focused mind ready to live the rest of my days entirely on my own absolute terms. The morning after my final visit to the precinct, a fleet of industrial white vans pulled into my driveway, their tires crunching loudly against the gravel. A highly coordinated professional hazmat and deep cleaning crew disembarked, moving with the disciplined efficiency of a military unit. I stood on the front porch with a steaming cup of black coffee, watching them haul massive, heavy-duty black plastic bins up the front steps. They wore thick canvas coveralls and industrial respirators, fully equipped to handle the severe water damage and the lingering stench of desperation that Cameron and Haley had left behind in my home. The lead contractor, a broad-shouldered man with a clipboard, approached me and outlined their aggressive remediation strategy. They were instructed to strip the waterlogged drywall, extract the ruined synthetic flooring, and chemically treat every exposed surface to prevent black mold. They hauled industrial-grade dehumidifiers and high-powered ozone generators directly into the foyer, plugging thick black cables into the wall outlets. The deep, vibrating hum of their machinery instantly replaced the suffocating silence of the empty house. It was the mechanical sound of absolute eradication. I directed the crew specifically toward the guest bedrooms and the master suite, instructing them to indiscriminately bag every single item left behind by the squatters. I did not want a single piece of their clothing, a single cosmetic bottle, or a single scrap of their fabricated luxury remaining within my walls. The workers moved relentlessly, tossing expensive designer garments and shattered electronics into the reinforced trash bins with zero hesitation or care. The heavy thud of their discarded lives hitting the bottom of the plastic dumpsters echoed through the hallway, a rhythmic drumbeat signaling the reclamation of my territory. I refused to remain a passive observer in the restoration of my own sanctuary. I set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter and walked directly to the front door. Haley's absurdly overpriced monogrammed welcome mat lay across the threshold, a final pathetic marker of her failed attempt to claim my estate. I dug my boots into the fabric, grabbed the thick braided edge with both hands, and ripped it off the porch. I marched straight to the industrial dumpster idling in the driveway and hurled the mat into the rusting steel container. It landed with a satisfying slap against a pile of discarded water-ruined drywall. I turned back into the house, my blood pumping with a fierce, rejuvenating adrenaline. I walked into the living room, marching straight toward the massive bay windows. Haley had draped them in heavy, suffocating velvet curtains purchased entirely with the funds she had siphoned from my stolen credit cards. I grabbed the thick fabric, wrapped it securely around my forearms, and pulled backward with a sudden violent surge of raw strength. The brass curtain rod buckled instantly under the immense pressure. The screws tore violently out of the plaster, showering white dust over my shoulders as the entire fixture crashed heavily to the floorboards. I dragged the massive pile of velvet straight out the front door and tossed it into the dumpster to join the welcome mat. The physical purging of the property perfectly mirrored the spiritual purging of my life. Every violent tear of fabric, every shattered piece of their fake aristocratic decor hitting the trash bin functioned as a deliberate exorcism. I scoured the kitchen cabinets, emptying the imported organic teas and expensive culinary tools Haley had hoarded, dumping them directly into a heavy black contractor bag. I marched upstairs and cleared out the bathroom vanity, sweeping hundreds of dollars of elite skincare products into the trash with a single, aggressive motion of my arm. They had invaded my fortress like a toxic infection, attempting to slowly suffocate the host to feed their own insatiable greed. Now I was administering the cure. I scrubbed the counters, the shelves, and the hardwood floors with a relentless, punishing focus. I wanted every trace of their scent, every echo of their arrogant laughter, and every single fingerprint they had left on my property violently and permanently erased from existence. By the end of the third day, the relentless roar of the industrial dehumidifiers finally ceased. The cleaning crew packed up their heavy machinery, rolled up their thick cables, and drove their white vans off my property. I stood alone in the center of the downstairs hallway, breathing in the newly restored atmosphere. The stale, humid stench of stagnant water and squatter entitlement had been completely eradicated. In its place, the sharp, clean scent of fresh pine cleaner and a newly applied coat of bone-white paint permeated every single room. The walls were immaculate, free of water stains, and the superficial, expensive art pieces Haley had forcefully hung over Brenda's carefully chosen photographs. I had spent hours meticulously repositioning my late wife's cherished possessions, ensuring the house reflected the exact warmth and dignity it possessed before the invasion. Brenda's hand-painted ceramic bowls were back on the kitchen island. The antique brass clock ticked reliably on the mantelpiece, its steady rhythmic cadence echoing beautifully through the pristine hallways. The deep, festering wounds inflicted upon the house had been fully sanitized and permanently sealed. The property was breathing again, restored to its rightful status as an honorable, quiet fortress. However, as I walked into the main living room, the space felt noticeably incomplete. The water-damaged hardwood had been fully replaced and polished to a brilliant reflecting shine, but the center of the room was completely bare. The old leather armchair where I had sat and absorbed Cameron's physical assault had been ruined by the flooding, and the synthetic sofa Haley had brought in had been tossed into the dumpster on the very first day. The room was perfect, but it desperately lacked its anchoring centerpiece. I checked my watch, noting the precise time just as the loud, heavy grind of air brakes echoed from the street outside. A massive, pristine delivery truck backed slowly into my freshly cleared driveway. The heavy steel rear door rolled upward with a sharp metallic clatter. Two burly delivery men in matching uniforms jumped down onto the pavement, completely bypassing the front steps to lower a heavy aluminum ramp. I walked out onto the porch, opening the double doors wide to accommodate the incoming arrival. The men worked in flawless synchronization, hauling a massive, securely wrapped package up the ramp and into my foyer. They carefully sliced away the thick protective plastic and the heavy cardboard bindings. Beneath the packaging sat a brand new premium mahogany leather sofa, its rich polished surface gleaming under the afternoon sunlight. It was a solid, unyielding piece of craftsmanship designed to endure decades of use without showing a single crack. The men hoisted the heavy furniture, carrying it directly into the center of the living room. They positioned it perfectly on the gleaming hardwood floor, establishing a brand new foundation for the rest of my life. The heavy silence wrapping around the house was no longer a suffocating blanket of tension. It was a profound, unshakable tranquility. There was absolutely no more yelling echoing down the pristine hallways. The condescending glares, the constant draining psychological warfare, and the arrogant stomping of expensive shoes across my hardwood floors had been permanently eradicated. The toxic storm that Cameron and Haley had dragged into my sanctuary was entirely dissipated, leaving behind a crisp, undeniable clarity. Their grandiose illusions of untouchable wealth and unearned power had violently collided with the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. Private investigator Ramirez had not just handed the federal prosecutor a neat package of real estate fraud. He had delivered a comprehensive, fully documented map of the underground gambling syndicate threatening my son. Armed with Ramirez's intercepted communications and meticulously gathered financial ledgers, the FBI executed a massive, highly coordinated raid on the loan sharks. The ruthless bookies who had promised to shatter Cameron's kneecaps were currently sitting in maximum security federal lockup, their entire criminal operation dismantled in a single night. They would never collect their $60,000, and they would never pose a physical threat to my property again. Cameron and Haley were currently trapped in their own inescapable reality. Stripped of their tailored designer suits, their untraceable burner phones, and their fabricated societal status, they were confined to sterile federal holding cells awaiting their trial. The mandatory minimums for aggravated wire fraud and elder abuse practically guaranteed a decade of concrete walls, steel bars, and scheduled meals. The high society masquerade was completely dead. They were no longer the arrogant heirs apparent dictating the terms of my existence. They were common federal inmates facing the brutal, uncompromising consequences of their own limitless greed. I walked deliberately into the center of the living room, the heavy soles of my boots completely silent against the newly polished wood. I turned and lowered my weight onto the brand-new premium mahogany leather sofa. The material was firm, rich, and impeccably crafted, offering a deep anchoring support that the previous cheap synthetic furniture never possessed. It felt permanent. It felt like a foundation built to withstand decades of history without yielding an inch. I let my shoulders drop, sinking into the leather, feeling the lingering physical exhaustion of the past several months finally begin to seep out of my bones. I reached out to the antique side table and picked up a heavy crystal tumbler and a bottle of 20-year-aged bourbon I had kept safely locked away in my study. I unscrewed the cork, the satisfying pop breaking the quiet ambiance of the evening. I poured the amber liquid slowly, watching it catch the warm ambient light filtering in from the hallway sconces. The rich, smoky aroma of toasted oak and vanilla immediately filled the space around me, replacing the faint, lingering memory of wet drywall and industrial cleaners. It was the scent of absolute survival. I took a slow, measured sip. The bourbon burned a smooth, fiery trail down my throat, a warm and grounding sensation that solidified my total reclamation of the estate. I picked up the television remote from the polished glass coffee table. I pressed the power button and the giant flat screen mounted on the far wall instantly flashed to life. The vibrant green turf of a professional football stadium flooded the room with brilliant color. The booming, energetic voices of the sports announcers and the roaring cheer of 70,000 distant fans surged through the surround sound speakers. The noise was loud, chaotic, and entirely under my control. It was not the sound of ungrateful children plotting my demise or the crash of severed water pipes. It was simply the comforting, familiar tradition of a Sunday night football game. I settled deeper into the premium leather, letting the bright, shifting light of the broadcast wash over my face. The house was alive again, humming with a robust, undeniable energy that belonged entirely to me. I lowered the television remote and placed it gently onto the pristine, empty leather cushion directly beside me. It rested there completely undisturbed, a small but profound symbol of absolute sovereignty. There was no entitled son pacing the floor, waiting to snatch the device from my hands to assert his unearned dominance. There was no hostile daughter-in-law rolling her eyes, demanding I surrender the living room to accommodate her shallow, fabricated social gatherings. That simple black piece of plastic would remain exactly where I placed it until I personally decided to move it. The silent readjustment I had meticulously orchestrated was finally and entirely complete. I had not resorted to blind rage, physical violence, or pointless screaming arguments. I had utilized immense patience, flawless legal strategy, and the uncompromising power of the absolute truth to dismantle their entire operation. The malignant rot that had attempted to infect the very foundation of my home had been surgically and aggressively cut out. I had severed the toxic, parasitic attachments that had disguised themselves as familial love. I did not mourn the loss of the treacherous individuals sitting in federal holding. The agonizing betrayal had fully calloused into a protective armor of deep, unshakable self-respect. I had reestablished the absolute boundaries of my existence, proving that my dignity, my assets, and my quiet sanctuary were entirely off-limits. The transition from targeted victim to victorious architect was finalized in this peaceful room. The air was clean, the perimeter was permanently secured, and the internal hierarchy of my world was definitively reset. I turned my attentions back to the massive flat-screen television just as the offensive line snapped the football. The stadium crowd roared through the speakers in a deafening, unified wave of anticipation. The quarterback stepped back into the pocket, scanning the chaotic field with practiced, predatory vision. He launched a flawless, spiraling pass deep into the end zone. The wide receiver leaped into the air, securing the ball tightly against his chest as his feet slammed down onto the painted turf. A vibrant graphic flashed across the screen, confirming the decisive game-winning touchdown. I raised my crystal tumbler in the quiet living room, offering a silent, solitary toast to the undeniable victory unfolding before me. I took a final, satisfying sip of the aged bourbon, letting the warmth settle deeply into my chest. The brutal, exhausting match that Cameron and Haley had forced me to play was officially terminated. They had gambled everything on the assumption that a father's love was synonymous with endless, blinding weakness. They were catastrophically wrong. The game was over. The creator of the rules had definitively won. The heavy silence wrapping around the house was no longer a suffocating blanket of tension. It was a profound, unshakable tranquility. There was absolutely no more yelling echoing down the pristine hallways. The condescending glares, the constant draining psychological warfare, and the arrogant stomping of expensive shoes across my hardwood floors had been permanently eradicated. The toxic storm that Cameron and Haley had dragged into my sanctuary was entirely dissipated, leaving behind a crisp, undeniable clarity. Their grandiose illusions of untouchable wealth and unearned power had violently collided with the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. Private investigator Ramirez had not just handed the federal prosecutor a neat package of real estate fraud. He had delivered a comprehensive, fully documented map of the underground gambling syndicate threatening my son. Armed with Ramirez's intercepted communications and meticulously gathered financial ledgers, the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed a massive, highly coordinated raid on the loan sharks. The ruthless bookies who had promised to shatter Cameron's kneecaps were currently sitting in maximum security federal lockup, their entire criminal operation dismantled in a single night. They would never collect their $60,000, and they would never pose a physical threat to my property again. Cameron and Haley were currently trapped in their own inescapable reality. Stripped of their tailored designer suits, their untraceable burner phones, and their fabricated societal status, they were confined to sterile federal holding cells awaiting their sentencing. The mandatory minimums for aggravated wire fraud and elder abuse practically guaranteed a decade of concrete walls, steel bars, and scheduled meals. The high society masquerade was completely dead. They were no longer the arrogant heirs apparent dictating the terms of my existence. They were common federal inmates facing the brutal consequences of their actions. I walked deliberately into the center of the living room, my boots entirely silent against the newly polished wood. I turned and lowered my weight onto the brand-new premium mahogany leather sofa. The material was firm, rich, and impeccably crafted, offering a deep anchoring support that the previous cheap synthetic furniture never possessed. It felt permanent. It felt like a foundation built to withstand decades of history without yielding an inch. I let my shoulders drop, sinking into the leather, feeling the lingering physical exhaustion of the past several months finally begin to seep out of my bones. I reached out to the antique side table and picked up a heavy crystal tumbler and a bottle of 20-year-aged bourbon I had kept safely locked away in my study. I unscrewed the cork, the satisfying sound breaking the quiet ambiance of the evening. I poured the amber liquid slowly, watching it catch the warm, ambient light filtering in from the hallway sconces. The rich, smoky aroma of toasted oak and vanilla immediately filled the space around me, replacing the faint, lingering memory of wet drywall and industrial cleaners. It was the scent of absolute survival. I took a slow, measured sip. The bourbon burned a smooth, fiery trail down my throat, a warm and grounding sensation that solidified my total reclamation of the estate. I picked up the television remote from the polished glass coffee table. I pressed the power button, and the giant flat screen mounted on the far wall instantly flashed to life. The vibrant green turf of a professional football stadium flooded the room with brilliant color. The booming, energetic voices of the sports announcers and the roaring cheer of 70,000 distant fans surged through the surround sound speakers. The noise was loud, chaotic, and entirely under my control. It was not the sound of ungrateful children plotting my demise or the crash of severed water pipes. It was simply the comforting, familiar tradition of a Sunday night football game. I settled deeper into the premium leather, letting the bright, shifting light of the broadcast wash over my face. The house was alive again, humming with a robust, undeniable energy that belonged entirely to me. It was a peace earned through strategic silence and calculated patience, far removed from the chaotic noise of manipulation and greed. Every sip of the aged spirit reminded me of the enduring strength required to weather the storm and emerge unbroken. I lowered the television remote and placed it gently onto the pristine, empty leather cushion directly beside me. It rested there completely undisturbed, a small but profound symbol of absolute sovereignty. There was no entitled son pacing the floor, waiting to snatch the device from my hands to assert his unearned dominance. There was no hostile daughter-in-law rolling her eyes, demanding I surrender the living room to accommodate her shallow, fabricated social gatherings. That simple black piece of plastic would remain exactly where I placed it, until I personally decided to move it. The silent readjustment I had meticulously orchestrated was finally and entirely complete. I had not resorted to blind rage, physical violence, or pointless screaming arguments. I had utilized immense patience, flawless legal strategy, and the uncompromising power of the absolute truth to dismantle their entire operation. The malignant rot that had attempted to infect the very foundation of my home had been surgically and aggressively cut out. I had severed the toxic parasitic attachments that had disguised themselves as familial love. I did not mourn the loss of the treacherous individuals sitting in federal holding. The agonizing betrayal had fully calloused into a protective armor of deep, unshakable self-respect. I had reestablished the absolute boundaries of my existence, proving that my dignity, my assets, and my quiet sanctuary were entirely off-limits. The transition from targeted victim to victorious architect was finalized in this peaceful room. The air was clean, the perimeter was permanently secured, and the internal hierarchy of my world was definitively reset. No one would ever trespass on my peace again. I turned my attention back to the massive flat-screen television just as the offensive line snapped the football. The stadium crowd roared through the speakers in a deafening, unified wave of anticipation. The quarterback stepped back into the pocket, scanning the chaotic field with practiced, predatory vision. He launched a flawless, spiraling pass deep into the end zone. The wide receiver leaped into the air, securing the ball tightly against his chest as his feet slammed down onto the painted turf. A vibrant graphic flashed across the screen, confirming the decisive, game-winning touchdown. I raised my crystal tumbler in the quiet living room, offering a silent, solitary toast to the undeniable victory unfolding before me. I took a final, satisfying sip of the aged bourbon, letting the warmth settle deeply into my chest. The brutal, exhausting match that Cameron and Haley had forced me to play was officially terminated. They had gambled everything on the assumption that a father's love was synonymous with endless, blinding weakness. They were catastrophically wrong. The game is over. The creator of the rules has definitively won. True strength is never demonstrated through screaming matches or violent outbursts, but through the quiet, unbreakable resolve of absolute boundaries. When parasitic greed attempts to disguise itself as familial love, the only viable cure is surgical precision and undeniable truth. You must never allow anyone to leverage your compassion into a weapon against your dignity. Protect your peace at all costs, even if it means permanently severing the ties you once cherished most. Did this story resonate with you? Share your thoughts on setting boundaries in the comments below, like this video, and subscribe for more empowering daily life lessons.